The throne room of the capital, Ardani, glowed with gold. Hundreds of candles were reflected in the marble columns. The nobility stood along the walls, whispering among themselves. In the center of the hall stood the hunter, Caden. He was 26 years old. His wyvern skin jacket looked like a beggar's rag against the backdrop of the courtier's silks. 3 days earlier, he had single-handedly slain an ancient basilisk that had wiped out an entire garrison and was closing in on the king's summer residence. Royal law required that the hero be rewarded with land and a title. King Tedric sat on the throne, smiling slightly. That smile did not bode well. The herald unfurled a scroll and announced that the hunter Caden was granted the title of Lord and dominion over the gray borders, along with all its mountains, rivers, and coastline. Laughter rippled through the hall. At first, it was quiet. Then it became open and loud. Everyone in the kingdom knew the gray borders. A cursed frontier in the north, a land where storms had raged for decades, where the earth shook every week, where rivers burst their banks and swept away any village, where the Harem volcano smoldered above the mountains, blanketing the valleys with ash. Criminals were exiled there, and none survived. The king was handing the hero a death sentence wrapped in gold, and the entire court understood this. Chancellor Morven leaned toward his neighbor and said that the hunter would now fall to his knees and beg for another land. His neighbor replied that the hunter would more likely flee the kingdom that very night. Everyone waited for either a plea or disgrace. Caden slowly raised his head. He was looking not at the king, but at the map of the kingdom behind the throne. His eyes traced the line of the northern coast, counting something. Then he dropped to one knee and loudly thanked His Majesty for his generosity. The hall fell silent in surprise. Caden continued. He asked that 3 conditions be included in the Charter of Grant: full judicial authority for the lord over his lands, exemption from royal taxes for 15 years, as granted to uninhabitable territories under the old law regarding wastelands, and the right to accept any settlers without the crown's approval. Chancellor Morven turned pale. The old law regarding wastelands did indeed exist. It had been enacted 200 years ago, and no one remembered it. No one except the hunter in the worn jacket. The king could not refuse in front of the entire court. The law was on the side of the recipient. Tedric gritted his teeth and nodded. The scribe entered the terms into the charter. Caden took the scroll, bowed, and left the hall amid complete silence. No one wanted to laugh anymore. For some reason, laughing felt unsettling. Morven watched him go and thought that this man had walked toward the throne already knowing what he would be given. He had been preparing. He had been reading the statutes. Ordinary hunters don't read the statutes. A week later, Caden set out for the north with a single pack horse and 2 carts of supplies. Mercenaries refused to accompany him, even for triple the pay. Only 5 people went with him. Bren, the old captain of the guard who'd been expelled from service for breaking the Baron's jaw in a fight, Holt, the blacksmith, who had fled his debts, Selma, a widowed healer with her 2 children, and Pip, a mute young man whom Caden had once rescued from a ghoul's lair. Bren didn't believe in the whole venture for a single copper. He was riding along because he had nowhere else to go. He watched the new lord's back and thought he'd bury him before the first snow fell. The journey took 20 days. With each passing day, the sky grew darker. Beyond the pass in the Bone Range, they encountered the gray boundaries. Bren had seen wars and sieges, but here his throat went dry. A dead plain stretched all the way to the horizon. The wind howled so fiercely that the horses crouched. Tornadoes swept across the plain like living columns reaching up to the clouds. In the east, above the mountains, a crimson glow from a volcano. The ground beneath their feet trembled faintly, without ceasing. No trees, no grass, only gray rock and dust. Selma pulled the children close to her. Holt cursed and fell silent. Caden leaped off his horse and placed his palm on the trembling ground. And at that moment, a voice rang out in his head, calm and clear as the tolling of a bell. The voice announced that the rightful owner of the land had been detected. The voice announced that the system of natural dominion had been activated. A transparent panel unfolded before Caden's eyes, visible only to him. Lord Caden, Level 1. Gray Boundaries Territory. Earth Harmony, 0 out of 100. Elemental Bonds, 0 out of 4. The voice explained the rules. Every element of this land that has run amok has a living human embodiment. The spirit of the hurricane, the spirit of water, the spirit of earth, and the spirit of fire. The elements have gone mad due to an ancient wound in this land, and therefore rage without ceasing. They cannot be subdued by force. They cannot be killed, for then the land would die completely. An alliance is possible only if it is voluntary. For every alliance formed, the Lord receives a portion of the element's power. The more harmoniously the territory develops, the stronger both the Lord and his elemental allies become. The first mission was already flashing on the panel. Find the heart of the storm within 10 days. The reward for success was an alliance with the spirit of the wind. The penalty for failure was not specified. Instead of a penalty, there was only a note stating that in 10 days, the great storm would wipe the newcomer's camp from the plain. Caden closed the panel and surveyed his party. 5 adults, 2 children, and 7 horses against a land that had wiped out entire garrisons. He ordered them to set up camp in a rocky alcove at the foot of the pass, where the wind was weaker. Bran asked if the Lord was planning to build a castle out of dust there. There was a bitter weariness. Caden replied that the castle would have to wait. First, he was going to go talk to the hurricane. Bran thought he must have misheard. Then he decided the Lord had lost his mind. Caden was already unpacking his things. He pulled out hunting gear that Bran had never seen before. Ice claws, ropes made from wyvern tendons, a heavy cloak with bone plates. He was getting ready as calmly as one would for a duck hunt. Selma quietly asked Bren what they should do if the Lord didn't return. Bren didn't answer. He watched the whirlwinds sweep across the plain, and for the first time in 20 years of service, he didn't know what to say. That night, the ground shook so violently that a rock slide came down from the pass. The horses broke free from their tethers. The children were crying. And at dawn, Caden left the camp alone. He walked straight toward the largest tornado, which had been standing in the center of the plain for more than a decade. The local exiles, when used to call it the Eternal Pillar. The wind knocked him off his feet a mile away from it. Caden hammered the first piton into the rock, secured the rope, and took a step forward. A panel flashed before his eyes. 9 days remained until the heart of the storm. The wind cut into his face like glass shards. Caden had been walking for 3 hours and had covered less than 2 miles. He moved as one does in the mountains during avalanche season, in short dashes from boulder to boulder. The rope trailed behind him from piton to piton. He hammered each hook into the cracks in the rock. His cloak, reinforced with bone plates, absorbed the flying rocks. One rock the size of a fist still pierced a plate and sliced open his shoulder. The display indicated that he had taken damage. Caden bandaged the wound and pressed on. He wasn't the madman Bren had taken him to be. He was a hunter, and a hunter studies his prey before the hunt. Back in the capital, he'd spent 3 nights poring over the royal archives. He'd pulled up every report on the gray boundaries from the past 200 years, and he'd found an anomaly that no one had been looking for. The storms here didn't rage chaotically. All the tornadoes over the past 2 centuries had circled around a single point, the Eternal Pillar. And marked beneath the pillar on old maps was the Temple of the 4 Winds, destroyed during the conquest of these lands by the ancient king of Ardani. The king's army had burned the temple and slaughtered its guardians. It was from that year onward that the eternal storms began. The system only confirmed his hunch. The eye of the storm was where the earth had been wounded. By sunset, he had reached the ring of dead calm. Every hurricane has such a ring. Outside, a wall of wind roared as high as the sky. Inside, there was a ringing silence. And at the center of that silence lay ruins. The shards of white columns, shattered offering bowls, charred bones beneath a layer of 200-year-old dust. And on the steps of the ruined altar sat a girl. Caden stopped. She looked to be about 20 years old. Her hair, the color of a thundercloud, stirred of its own accord. Her skin shimmered with a pale silver glow. Her eyes were white and pupilless, like the sky before a storm. Her bare feet didn't touch the stone by the width of a palm. The panel unfolded on its own. Alira, the embodiment of a hurricane, the spirit of the wind of the gray realms. State, madness of grief. Threat level, lethal. Alira turned her head. The wind inside the ring stirred. She asked why a mortal had come to die in her silence. Her voice sounded like a draft in an empty house. Caden slowly unfastened the hammer from his belt and laid it on the ground. Then the knife. Then he removed his plate-reinforced cloak. He stood unarmed. He said he had not come to fight. He had come to find out what had happened here. Her white eyes narrowed. Cutting streams of air swirled around Caden. One swept across his cheek, leaving a trail of blood. Alira said that for 200 years, only murderers had come here. Knights with enchanted blades, mages with chains of spells. They all wanted to kill the storm. No one asked why the storm was crying. Caden sat down on a rock across from her. Blood trickled down his cheek, and he didn't wipe it away. He said he was asking now. And Alira told him. Words burst from her along with the gusts of wind. 200 years ago, a temple stood here, and the winds were gentle. The guardians sang hymns, and the winds carried rain to the fields. Then an army came from the south. The guardians were herded into the temple and set ablaze. Alira was bound by an ancient covenant and could not kill people as long as the altar stood. She watched as her singers burned. Then the soldiers smashed the altar, and the covenant was broken. And she went mad with freedom and grief. Ever since, she has been circling above this place, unable to stop. The storm is her cry. She has been crying out for 200 years. Caden listened without interrupting. When she fell silent, he spoke. He did not ask for forgiveness on behalf of the ancient king. Another's guilt was not his concern. He said something else. He said that the dead guardians do not need her cry. The dead need remembrance. And remembrance is when songs are sung once more on the site of the ruins. He offered her a pact, not a chain nor a cage. A union of equals sealed by her will. He would rebuild the Temple of the Four Winds as the first structure on his land. He would find singers, and the hymns would ring out once more. And she would calm the storm and become the guardian of the sky of the gray boundaries. Not a servant, a guardian. Alira was silent for a long time. Then she asked why she should believe a mortal. All mortals lie. Caden replied that she didn't need to believe him. She just had to verify it. Let her give him a year. If, in a year's time, there was no temple standing in this spot, let her storm take him first. He was staking his own life on it, and doing so of his own free will. Her white eyes gazed at him for a long time. Then Alira held out her hand. The panel flashed. An elemental bond is proposed. The spirit of the wind gives its consent. Caden took her hand. Her palm was as cool as the morning air. The world around them exploded with light. The power of a hurricane surged into him through her hand. The panel recorded the changes. Elemental bonds, 1 of 4. First-tier Windlord ability acquired. Lord level raised to 3. Earth harmony, 5 out of 100. And outside the ring, something was happening that the gray boundaries hadn't seen in 200 years. The wall of the hurricane slowed. Tornadoes across the plain fell one by one like weary dancers. The howling subsided, and silence fell. At the camp by the pass, people rushed out of their tents. Bren stood with his mouth agape. The sky was clearing. For the first time, the sun broke through the eternal dusty haze. Holt took off his hat. Selma began to cry. Silent Pip laughed silently and pointed at the sky. Bren hadn't prayed in 20 years, but now his lips whispered an old soldier's prayer of their own accord. 2 days later, Caden returned to camp. Walking beside him was a girl with hair the color of a thundercloud, her feet barely touching the ground. Bren stepped forward to meet them and silently dropped to one knee. The old captain was at a loss for words. Words weren't needed. He no longer thought he'd bury the Lord before the snow fell. He thought he'd follow this man wherever he was ordered to go. Caden helped him up and said it was too early to rejoice. The panel was already flashing a new message, and it was alarming. For 200 years, the winds had kept the dust aloft and blocked the mountain passes. Now the sky had cleared, and with it, the roads had opened. The very first trade scout would report to the south that the cursed land had come to life. And the winds had blown the water off the plains. Now the rains would fall freely and flow into the dead riverbeds. And the rivers of the gray frontiers had long been blocked by landslides. Water will begin to pool in the upper valley. The system has already posted the second mission, to find the spirit of water before the overflowing valley bursts its banks and the flood washes away the plain along with the camp. The deadline is 30 days. Alira looked east, where the flooded valley lay beyond the hills, and quietly said that the Sister of Water was even more mad than she was. The wind screams. The water is silent and drowns. The first month of the gray border's new life passed like a single long breath. Caden sent letters to all the northern cities where the landless were starving. The letters promised land free of taxes and justice free from the baron's tyranny. At first, 12 people arrived, ragged and distrustful. They saw the clear sky above the cursed plain and stayed. A week later, 50 arrived. 2 weeks later, 300. People came in families with carts and goats. Holt set up a blacksmith shop and didn't leave the anvil all day. Bren gathered a militia of 40 men from among the new arrivals. Selma set up a clinic in the very first log cabin. A settlement sprang up where the camp had been, which the people themselves named Wind City. And on the ruins of the temple, the first new columns were already gleaming white. Caden found an old priest among the settlers who remembered the hymns to the winds, and for the first time in 200 years, Aylar heard singing. That evening, a warm, gentle whirlwind swirled over the settlement, and people said the sky was laughing. The earth's harmony rose to 11. The Lord's level rose to 5. But every night, Caden climbed the hill and looked east. There, beyond the ridge in the upper valley, water was pooling. Alira flew out on reconnaissance and returned looking gloomy. Ancient landslides had blocked the gorge, and the valley had turned into a basin. The rains, which now fell freely, filled the basin with each passing day. Glenholm, the old miners' town, had been submerged a century ago. Now the water had risen to the tops of the flooded towers. When the basin overflowed, A wall of water 30 cubits high would rush down the riverbed straight onto the plain, straight toward Wind City. The system was counting down the days. 16 remained. On the 17th day before the deadline, a guest from the south arrived in Wind City. Royal Inspector Fabian, accompanied by a guard of 10 plate-armored knights. Chancellor Morven had sent him to investigate the rumors. Fabian rode here with a report already formed in his mind. He intended to describe a desolate wasteland and a mad lord. He rode onto the pass and reined in his horse. Below lay a settlement of 400 households. Smoke rose from the stoves. Axes were clanging. Plows were moving across the cleared fields. And above the white temple, a girl made of wind was dancing in the sky. Fabian sat motionless in the saddle for a quarter of an hour. His clerk asked 3 times what to write down. The inspector finally told him to write down everything exactly as it was, because in the capital they wouldn't believe such a thing without a seal and an oath. Caden received the inspector politely. He showed him the village, the smithy, and the temple. He hid nothing. Fabian left the next day, taking with him a report that was bound to strike the chancellor's desk like a bolt of lightning. That same night, Caden set out for the flooded valley. He took only Alira with him, along with the mute Pip, who had grown up by the river and swam like an otter. They set up camp at the water's edge. The water in the valley lay still and black. No waves, no ripples. A dead calm from one end to the other. Alira said her sister was down there, in the sunken city. She could sense her cold. The wind couldn't penetrate the water. From there on, the Lord would go alone. Caden prepared as if for a hunt. He questioned the elders about Glenholm. The city wasn't flooded all at once. First, the miners uncovered an underground river. Then, a greedy magistrate ordered them to deepen the tunnels despite the water. The river burst its banks and swept away the city in a single night. Along with the city, the lockmaster's daughter, a girl named Myrna, whom the magistrate had ordered locked in the lock tower so her father wouldn't stop the pumps. Her father pumped water until the very end and died at the levers. The girl was never let out. Caden listened and pieced the story together. The spirit of the water hadn't simply gone mad here. The spirit of the water had taken the form of the most terrible local grievance. At dawn, he stripped to the waist, tied a rope around himself, and stepped into the black water. The panel warned him that his wind abilities would be useless in the water. He dove in. The water was icy and still as glass. He swam downstream along the flooded street. Dead houses stared out through their empty windows. Near the gate tower, the water suddenly parted on its own, forming a bubble of air. An invitation, or a trap. Caden swam into the tower and stepped onto the dry floor. A woman stood in the middle of the hall. Her hair, like dark water, flowed down to the floor and seeped into the cracks. A dress made of river mist, eyes like 2 whirlpools. She looked like an adult but held her hands the way a caged child does, wrapped around her own shoulders. The panel displayed a name, Mirael, the embodiment of water, a state of frozen grief. She didn't scream like Alira. She spoke quietly, and that silence made one's blood run cold. She asked if he had come to draw water too. Everyone comes to draw water. They knock, they dig, they carry it away. No one comes to open the door. Caden understood instantly. For 200 years, everyone who fought the floods had built dams and dug canals. Everyone fought the water. No one asked about the locked-up girl. He said he had come to open the door. Right now. He approached the tower's gate, which had been held shut for a century by a rusty moth with the magistrate's seal, and knocked the bolt down with 3 blows from a stone. The door swung open. Mirael stared at the opening, her whirlpool-like eyes trembling. She whispered that the door was open, but she still couldn't go out. the city had drowned. The entire world of this valley had drowned. There was nowhere to go. Then Caden offered her the same thing he had offered her sister, an alliance. He would drain the valley and bury the dead of Glenholm according to custom. He would rebuild a new city on the shore and erect a fountain at its heart in memory of the lockkeeper and his daughter. The water would cease to be a prison and a grave. The water would become the lifeblood of the fields and roads, and Miriel would become the guardian of all the waters of his land, and no one would ever again lock her, or anyone else, away at her word. He granted her the right to open any door on this land. Miriel was silent for a long time. Then she slowly unclasped the arms with which she had been hugging her shoulders, and she held out her palm. The panel flashed. Elemental bonds, 2 of 4. First-tier Waterlord ability acquired. Lord level 8. Harmony 19. The water in the valley began to move. Miriel led it like a shepherd leads a flock. The black expanse flowed into the old riverbed in an even, obedient stream. Within a week, the valley had drained. Water filled the dead rivers of the plain, and for the first time in a century, the riverbeds of the gray boundaries murmured. The fields of Wind City received water. Pip ran along the canals, laughing silently. And at the bottom of the former basin, Glenholm was revealed, along with the bones of the miners, and Caden fulfilled his promise. 300 graves were dug in 3 days, and the priest performed funeral rites for all of them. Miriel stood over the grave of the lockkeeper all night. The next morning, she came to Caden and smiled for the first time. But the peace lasted exactly 1 scene in this world. First, the earth shook so violently that 4 furnaces cracked in Wind City. The tremors now occurred every day and were growing worse. The system posted the 3rd task, noting that the spirit of the earth was awakening from the noise of new life on the surface. And soon after, a messenger from Barren galloped in from the south. Across the river, on the border of their territories, Count Osmond, their neighbor to the south, had set up camp. 200 lances. The Count declared that, according to old maps, the drained valley belonged to his house, and he had come to claim what was his. Caden stood on a hill between the trembling earth and the enemy banners, realizing that the easy part of his journey was over. Count Osmond awaited negotiations at the ford with 200 lances at his back. He was a heavy-set man with a brick-red face and a habit of overwhelming his neighbors with sheer numbers. His plan was the following. The upstart hunter had 400 men with axes against trained cavalry. The upstart would get scared and hand over the valley. And then he'd hand over the rest, too. Caden arrived for the negotiations with 10 horsemen. Osmond unfolded an old map and pointed his finger at the valley. He said that the valley had been marked as disputed even in his grandfather's time and, by the right of the stronger party, belonged to him. Caden didn't argue about the maps. He asked the Count if he knew how to swim. Osmond didn't understand. Caden repeated the question and added that the Count and his camp were standing right in the old floodplain. And the rivers of this land now obey a single woman. And if by noon tomorrow the spears haven't been withdrawn beyond the boundary stone, the river will reclaim its floodplain. No one would drown. But the armor, the wagons, and the gunpowder would get soaked to the bone, and cavalry can't fight knee-deep in silt. Osmond burst out laughing and called it a fairy tale. At dawn, the river burst its banks silently and gently. The water did not rage, it simply came. By noon, the Count's camp stood waist-deep in water. Tents were floating away. Horses were tearing at their tethers. The gunpowder had turned to mud. And along the crest of the water walked a woman with hair like a dark river, and she looked at the Count with eyes, whirlpools. That single glance was enough. By sunset, 200 spears had crossed the boundary stone without looking back. Osman led his men away, taking with him a fear that would later cost Caden dearly. The frightened neighbor wrote a letter to the capital, but more on that later. For now, Caden had no time to celebrate. The earth had already shaken 3 times that day. A granary had collapsed in Vetrogard. Wells were cracking in the new villages. The tremors were coming from near the Bone Ridge, where the Empire's old mines loomed darkly. The system was counting down 20 days until the awakening of the Earth Spirit, and a note warned that an awakening in anger would bring the ridge crashing down onto the plain. Caden began again with the archives. He questioned the elders and dug out the papers he'd brought back from the capital. The mines of the Bone Ridge were dug by the ancient empire itself. They were dug by slaves. When the labor force was exhausted, the imperial governor ordered that the slaves not be brought to the surface, but that the entrances be collapsed so as not to have to pay for their sustenance. 3,000 people remained in the darkness. The earth has not forgotten this. Caden gathered supplies, ropes, and lamps. Illyra could not go underground. The wind has no way to circulate there. Morael could only go where there was water. Caden took Brenna and Holt with him. The old captain would not let the Lord go underground alone, and the blacksmith knew the mine supports and the rock. They entered the mine through a fissure that had been torn open by the last tremor. The darkness beneath the ridge was thick as pitch. The passages spiraled downward in circles. Marks from claws and fingernails remained on the walls. Holt was silent, and his jaw muscles twitched. On the 3rd day of their journey, they emerged into a gigantic cave, and there they saw her. She sat in the center of the cave amid the darkness, hugging her knees. 4 times the height of a human. Her skin was like gray granite veined with copper. Her hair was made of thin stone threads. Her eyes were closed. 3,000 skeletons in shackles lay in a ring around her. She sat among them like a mother among her sleeping children. The panel announced a name: Tamed, the embodiment of the earth. State: sleep in grief, awakening in 11 days. And then something happened that Caden hadn't anticipated. Holt saw the shackles. The blacksmith's great-grandfather had perished in the imperial mines, and it was a family wound. Holt growled and struck the rusty chain of the nearest skeleton with his hammer to free the bones. The clang of metal echoed through the cave. The stone eyelids twitched and opened. 2 eyes the color of molten copper stared at the 3 people with lamps. People with fire. Underground. Just like back then. Taravin rose, and the cave screamed in stone. The vault began to crack. Bren shielded the Lord with his shield, a desperate and futile gesture. The wrath of the awakened earth cannot be stopped by a shield. But Caden did the only thing a hunter backed into a corner could do. He didn't run. He stepped forward, set his lantern on the floor, and dropped to his knees beside the nearest skeleton. And he began to do what he had come to do. He pulled out a chisel and began chipping the shackles off the dead bones. Blow after blow, without looking at the mountain of rage looming over him. Holt swallowed hard and knelt down beside him. Then Bren. The 3 of them silently chipped away at the chains binding the dead while the disturbed stone growled above them. The copper eyes watched for a long time. The roar subsided. Taravin dropped to her knees and tilted her gigantic face toward Caden. She asked why the living were removing the iron from the dead. The dead feel no pain, Caden replied without stopping his work. The dead feel no pain. It is the earth that holds them that feels the pain. He had come to take her pain up above. Each of the 3,000 would be carried out into the sunlight and buried in free soil without a single chain. And the mines would be filled in or turned into a mausoleum with an eternal flame, as she herself decides. Taravin was silent. Then she said that the descendants of those who destroyed the entrances live above. Caden replied that those who fled from new chains live above. Debtors, the exiled, the widows. His land welcomes anyone who wants to live without shackles, and if she doesn't believe him, let her go up and see for herself. He offered her an alliance. She would become the guardian of the stone and the pillar of the cities. Not a single mine on his land would ever be dug by a slave's hand. It would be a law bearing her name, the law of Tamed. The giantess held out a palm the size of a table. Caden placed his hand on it. The panel flashed. Elemental bonds 3 of 4. First tier Lord of the Depths ability. Lord level 12. Harmony 34. It took a month to raise the bones. Tamed herself carried the dead to the surface, handling them as gently as if they were sleeping. 3,000 graves were laid on the sunlit slope, and the priest's voice grew hoarse from reciting funeral rites. And then the giantess walked across Caden's land, and the earth stopped trembling. Worse still for Caden's enemies. Tamed touched the walls of Wind City, and the walls rose from solid stone in a single night. A master stonemason among the settlers named Gottfried, who had been grumbling for a month that the Lord was building on sand and that without a proper foundation everything would collapse, came to the wall that morning. He pressed his palm against the stone, then his ear, then a plumb line. Then he sat down on the ground, right in the dust, and sat there for an hour. That evening, he burned his blueprints and asked the mountain to take him on as an apprentice. The mountain agreed. But every victory in this world came at a price, and Caden already knew that rule by heart. First, the panel displayed an alarming message. 3 elements are in alliance, but the 4th remains alone, and its heat is rising. The Harem volcano was belching smoke twice as thick. Fire is jealous. Fire does not forgive being called last. Second, a messenger returned from the south with news from well-wishers in the capital. Count Osmond's letter and Auditor Fabian's report landed on the king's desk on the same day. King Tedric read about the living rivers obedient to the Lord and the walls that had risen overnight. And he spoke words before the court that the messenger relayed verbatim. The king said that a vassal who commands the elements is no vassal. He is a threat to the crown. A royal embassy set out for the Grey Realm, demanding that Caden appear in the capital and surrender his so-called spirits to the crown. And an army was gathering in the wake of the embassy. The royal embassy arrived 2 weeks later. It was led personally by Chancellor Morven, which spoke to the gravity of the situation. The chancellor rode through the gates hewn from a single block of stone, his face unflinching. Morven was no Fabian. Morven knew how to remain unperturbed. He read the crown's demand aloud in the main hall of the new stone house. Lord Caden was to come to court and hand over all the spirits under his command to the crown as property of special value. The word property hung in the hall like the smell of burning. A lyra near the ceiling curled up into a small, angry whirlwind. Miriel, standing by the wall, looked like black ice. Caden replied calmly. He said that the spirits were not property, but free guardians of this land, bound to him by a voluntary alliance. They cannot be handed over, just as one cannot hand over another's wife or another's oath. And he would arrive in the capital later, once he had finished a matter on which the very survival of the entire North, including the Crown lands, depended. The Harem volcano is awakening. If it erupts, ash will blanket 4 provinces. Morven narrowed his eyes and asked if this was a threat. Caden replied that it was an invitation. Let the chancellor stay for a week and see everything with his own eyes. Morven stayed. This man always preferred to see things for himself. And that very night, Caden set out for the volcano. Harem was already roaring non-stop. Lava had reached the rim of the crater. Clouds of ash rose in a column above the mountain. The display read that there were 7 days until the eruption, and that the spirit of fire was in the fury of rejection. The 3 sisters are united. There is only one fire. There is always only one fire. Everyone fears fire. Caden walked toward the foot of the mountain with all 3 of them. A lyra carried him through the ash clouds. Miriel led a cool stream behind them. Taravin parted the solidified lava fields like a curtain. But at the very edge of the crater, all three stopped. Their power could go no further. The fire would not let the sisters pass. A pillar of flame shot up from the crater, and the flame coalesced into a figure, a woman clad in armor of cooling lava. Her hair was pure flame, reaching down to her waist. Her eyes were two abysses of white heat. Behind her back was a sword of fiery glass as tall as a man. The panel spoke her name: Pariah, the embodiment of fire, a state of prideful fury. And Pariah spoke first. She said she knew why he had come. He had tamed the weeping wind, the drowned woman, and the sleeping mountain with sweet words and pity. But fire cannot be tamed with pity. Fire does not weep. Fire does not sleep. Fire is taken only by force, or not at all. She offered the only deal she would accept, a duel on the rim of the crater. If he wins, she will follow him wherever he commands. If she wins, she will take his ashes for herself. Refusal is also an answer. Then, in 7 days, she will present the North with the greatest bonfire in its history. Bren grabbed the Lord by the shoulder. Selma, who had arrived with the supply train, screamed that this was certain death. A mortal cannot stand against the elements in her own home. Caden took off his cloak and handed it to Bren. He said that a hunter had spent his whole life facing beasts stronger than himself. The only difference was that this beast could not be killed. This beast had to be understood before it burned you. He stepped onto the edge of the crater. The duel began without a signal. Pariah attacked like an eruption. The fiery sword traced arcs that melted the stone. Caden didn't take any hits. He did what he did better than anyone else in the kingdom. He read the beast. He moved in rolling steps, summoning Elira's wind beneath his feet, and was half a step faster than the flames. He noticed the first thing. Pariah struck with sweeping, beautiful blows. Too beautiful. That's not how one fights to win. That's how one fights for the spectators. He noticed the second thing. Every time his sister's wind saved him, it wasn't anger that flashed in the eyes of the fire. It was longing. And Caden understood the truth about the fourth element. For 200 years, the three sisters had each suffered in their own grief, yet at least people had come to them. Knights fought the wind. Builders battled the water. Miners dug into the earth. No one came to the fire. Ever. They gave the volcano a wide berth, staying 100 miles away. Pariah's fury was the fury of one whom everyone feared, and so they had left her alone forever. Her duel was not a test of strength. Her duel was the only way she knew to make someone stay by her side, even if only for a short while. Caden did what no fighter would ever do. As she swung again, he stepped not away from the sword, but beneath it, into the blow. And he stood right next to her, lowering his arms. The fiery blade froze against his neck. His skin burned. He looked into her eyes of white heat and said that the fight was over because he had misunderstood her condition, and she, too, misunderstood him. She didn't need his victory. She didn't need his ashes. She needed someone to come to the fire and not run away. He had come. He was standing there. He wasn't running. And he would stay. Not for a week. Forever. His land needed fire. Holt's forges need heat. Homes need hearths. Nights need beacons. Winters need warm springs. Fire is not a calamity to be endured. Fire is the heart of a home. He offers her the chance to become the heart of his land, the first by the hearth, not the last by the crater. The sword of fiery glass wavered. Then it dropped. Then it scattered into sparks. Pariah stood there, and for the first time in 200 years, the white heat in her eyes flickered uncertainly. She said he would burn if he embraced the fire. Caden replied that he would find out, and he reached out his hand first. Piraya's palm was hot as a summer stone, but it didn't burn. The panel burst into light. Elemental bonds, 4 of 4. All elements in union. Nature Lord rank obtained. Lord level 18. Earth harmony, 52 out of 100. Great balance ability, unlocked. Hargrim sighed and drew the lava back in. The pillar of ash fell, and a wave of warmth swept across the entire Grey Realm, and every hearth in every home flared up of its own accord with a steady, gentle flame. People ran out into the streets and watched as, above the volcano, a pure glow rose like the northern lights in place of the black cloud. Chancellor Morven stood on the wall of Wind City and gazed at that glow. The wind danced nearby. Living water flowed through the canals. Beyond the city, the guardian mountains slumbered. Morven had served the throne his entire life and knew how to gauge power. He assessed the situation, and he realized it was already too late. That evening, he asked Caden for a private conversation. He said he would bring the truth to the king. And the truth was that the North was flourishing. Taxes from trade would flow to the crown like a river, and waging war against this land would be madness. But he was duty-bound to warn him. The king would not hear the truth. The king would hear fear. Osmond and his faction at court were already shouting that the hunter was building his own kingdom. The army would be assembled by spring, 12,000 swords, and that wasn't even the worst news. Morven lowered his voice. In the oldest archives of the crown, there is a record explaining why the ancient king once burned the temples of this land and set the people against the elements. The record states that the 4 elements of the Grey Realms are not merely spirits. They are guardians. Seals placed over something that sleeps deeper than the minds of Teravin and his older Hargrim himself. The ancient king wanted to reach it. The elements would not let him. So he destroyed their temples to weaken the seals, but he grew afraid of the consequences and stopped. Morven asked if the Lord knew exactly what his 4 guardians were protecting. Caden did not know. But in that very moment, his panel opened on its own and, for the first time, displayed a line he had never seen before. The 5th seal. Status. Cracked. And the system fell silent, answering not a single question. Winter came to the Grey Realms early, but for the first time in 200 years, it came as a guest rather than an executioner. Piraya warmed the underground veins beneath Wind City, and the houses were filled with steady warmth without a single log. Miriel channeled the warm springs to the bathhouses and bathing areas. Teravin carved covered roads out of the rock between the villages so that caravans could travel even in a blizzard. Alira diverted the blizzards toward the sea. People nicknamed this winter the First Merciful, and in the Temple of the 4 Winds, 4 hymns were now being sung. Settlers even made their way through the snow. By midwinter, 11,000 people lived on the land of Caden. Harmony had risen to 58, and the Lord's level had grown to 20. But Caden himself slept for 4 hours. The message about the cracked 5th seal glowed on the panel day and night, and the system was silent as a drowned man. He convened a council in the stone house. Seated at the long table were Bren Holt, Selma, the priest Gottfried, and the 4 guardians. Caden asked the sisters directly what it was they were guarding. And then something happened that he hadn't expected. All 4 lowered their eyes. Alira said she didn't remember. Miriel said she remembered only a cold deeper than her deepest waters. Teravin said that her sleep in the mines had not been only grief. Something down below sang her a lullaby, and she didn't want to wake up. Piraya remained silent the longest. Then she said that Fire remembered a little more than the sisters because Fire had been placed there last. The four of them were not born of this land. They were brought here, a very long time ago. Someone stronger than them imbued them with power and placed them in a circle above the depths. And then the memory of this was erased from them, for their own peace of mind. She remembers only one word from that time, the word primordial mother. It grew so quiet at the table that you could hear the candle crackling. Caden decided to go down, not into the Teravan mines, deeper. The panel flashed at the word primordial mother, and for the first time in months displayed a line of text. Access to information about the fifth seal will be granted at Harmony level 75. Until then, venturing into the depths is deadly dangerous. Caden stared at that line for a long time. The system that had been driving him forward with deadlines and threats was now putting up a barrier. That meant there was something down there that even the system itself was wary of. He postponed the descent and made a move the council did not understand. He announced that the entire winter would be devoted not to the army or the walls, but to gardens, schools, and roads. Bren stood up and, for the first time ever, raised his voice at the Lord. The old captain said that 12,000 royal swords would arrive by spring, yet the Lord intended to plant apple trees. This is madness, and as a man of the military, I refuse to understand it. Caden listened and replied calmly, "The strength of this land does not lie in swords. The panel values harmony. Harmony grows from the happiness of the people, not from a palisade of spears. Every school adds more to the strength of the guardians than 100 recruits." He asked Bren to trust him one more time. One last time, if necessary. Bren sat down, his jaw muscles twitching. He believed him. But he believed him grudgingly, and on the condition that he would double the size of the militia anyway. Caden agreed. Winter set to work. Teravan built schools out of solid stone overnight. Selma recruited teachers from literate settlers. Mirael filled the covered greenhouses with moisture, and Vetrograd ate fresh greens for the first time in January. Pariah taught Holt's blacksmiths to work with a heat unknown to any forge in the kingdom, and northern steel flowed south at the price of silver. Merchants brought back grain, books, and news. The news was bad. The king had declared Caden a rebel. Osmond had been promoted to field marshal. 12,000 troops were gathering near the capital, and battle mages were being hired from across the sea to join them. And the merchants were whispering about a new decree. Anyone who moved to the Grey Frontiers would be declared an outlaw, and their property would be forfeited to the crown. The decree was meant to stem the flow of people. It had the opposite effect. People fled north in twice the numbers because they had nothing left to lose. By the end of winter, 16,000 people lived in the land of Caden, and the Harmony stood at 63. During those same months, a strange family came together of its own accord in the stone house. For the first time in 200 years, the four guardians lived under one roof with humans and side by side with one another. At first, it was difficult. Elira and Pariah clashed so fiercely that the fire in the house would flicker out and then flare up again, and all the doors would slam shut at once. The wind teased the fire with a reverse wail. The fire called to the wind with a draft. Mirael remained silent for weeks, and Caden would find her at night by the memorial fountain, the one he'd promised to build and was the first to construct in the drained valley. Teravan couldn't fit inside the house and sat sadly outside until she learned to shrink herself to human size. In human form, she turned out to be ridiculously shy and hid behind Caden from Selma's noisy children. Caden behaved toward the four of them just as he would have toward 4 hunting partners on a long hunt, evenly, attentive, without sweet talk. He noticed that Alira calmed down when he listened to her chatter about the upper winds, and he listened for an hour at a time. He noticed that Miriel thawed when he stood silently beside her by the fountain, and he stood silently beside her. He dragged Taravin to the construction sites and asked for advice on every stone, and the mountain blossomed because it was being listened to rather than feared. Once a week, he would go out to the edge of the crater with Pariah for a training duel because he realized that combat was her language of tenderness. After each duel, she would laugh, and the fire in her eyes would soften. Selma, watching all this, shook her head and told Bren that the Lord had gathered not a military alliance, but brides from all four corners of the world, and he didn't even realize it. Bren replied that the Lord always sees everything. He just takes his time. On the last night of winter, something happened that shattered the peaceful order. Caden couldn't sleep, so he climbed up onto the wall. Below, the city slept. And suddenly, all four guardians appeared beside him in an instant. All four were looking south. Their faces were all equally tense. Alira said the wind had carried the scent of iron. Miriel said the rivers in the south sensed crossings. Taravin said the earth was counting footsteps, and there were many of them. Pariah spoke the shortest of all. They're coming. The king's army set out ahead of schedule. Osmond had convinced the king not to wait for the spring thaw, but to strike while the rivers were still frozen and his water witch was weak. There was some truth to that calculation. In winter, Miriel's power truly lay dormant in the ice-bound riverbeds. 12,000 marched at a forced pace, and they had 8 days left to reach the border of the gray boundaries. At that very moment, Caden's panel lit up with a new message that sent a chill down his spine. Attention! The approach of a large number of people with destructive intent is disrupting the Earth's harmony. Harmony at 63 and falling. If it falls below 50, the connection with the Guardians will weaken. War itself was a weapon against him. The closer the fear drew, the weaker his land became. The king was unaware of this and still struck at the most vulnerable spot. Caden convened a council in the middle of the night. He looked at the map of the north, and his finger rested on the only place where 8 days could be turned to his advantage. Wolf's Gate Gorge, the only winter pass through the Bone Ridge. He looked up at his men and his guardians and said there would be no war. There would be a hunt. And on a hunt, a beast isn't killed by sheer numbers. A beast is led where the hunter needs it to go. The council listened to Caden's plan in complete silence because it was based not on strength, but on knowledge of the beast. Caden laid it out just as one would plan a hunt. The beast, called the army, consists of a body and a head. The body is made up of 11,000 recruits gathered from the villages. These people do not want to die for a king they have never seen. The head is Osmond, his knights, and 50 overseas mages. The head drives the body through fear. Therefore, the hunt will not be for the body. The hunt will be for fear. No one must be killed. The panel clearly showed that every death would shatter the harmony like a stone. We will have to win in a way that no one has ever won before. For 8 days, the land prepared itself. Taravin went to the wolf gates first and worked invisibly beneath the snow. She did not destroy the gorge, she rebuilt it. The side trails merged, the walls shifted. The gorge turned into a 6-mile-long stone corridor with a single entrance and a single exit. Miriel asked forgiveness from the bound rivers, and the rivers answered her even through the ice. Beneath the ice, along the army's path, the water receded from their beds, and the ice became as hollow as a drum. Alira hovered over the southern plains for days on end, listening in on the enemy camp. She relayed their conversations word for word. The recruits were afraid. The recruits told each other by the campfires that there was a living mountain in the north and that the Lord there fed the families of anyone who came. Osmond had people hanged for such talk, and fear in the camp grew thicker. Pediah was eager to burn the supply trains, and Caden held her hand for an hour, persuading her that her move would be the last and most crucial one. The fire raged, but obeyed. As for Caden himself, he made a move that Bren called the most audacious in military history. He sent 300 letters to the enemy camp. Alira delivered them all in a single night and placed each letter on the chest of a sleeping recruit like the first snow. The letter contained 3 lines. Whoever lays down their weapons and comes north will receive land, a home, and justice free from the barrens. Whoever does not wish to go may simply remain at the rear of the column. The North does not wage war against the enslaved. The next morning, Osmond tore up the letters and hanged more troublemakers, but it was too late. You can't hang a letter. The words had burrowed into the army's very being like a splinter. The army reached Wolf's Gate on the 9th day. Osmond scouted the entrance and saw that the gorge was clear. The mages checked the stone for magic and found none, because Taravin is not magic. Taravin is nature. The column stretched its full length into the stone corridor, and when the rear of the column passed through the gorge's opening, what began there was later whispered about in the south until the end of the century. First, from behind, without a crash or a cloud of dust, the stone walls closed in and sealed off the exit, as soft as the palm of a hand. Then, ahead on the cliff above the corridor, Taravin stood to her full height of 4 sagens and simply looked down. 11,000 people saw a living mountain. The horses lay down. The people lay down beside the horses. Then water, which could not possibly exist in winter, ran down the walls of the gorge, and the water froze into patterns resembling waves, and within those patterns walked a woman with eyes like whirlpools. Then the wind descended from above, and the wind spoke. Alira carried Caden's voice over the column, and everyone heard the voice as if the Lord were standing right beside them. The voice said that not a single person here would die today. The voice said that the way back would open for anyone who laid down their weapons. The voice said that the way forward was open as well. It leads north toward the land and home, and those who chose life have already set out along it. And then, above the far edge of the gorge, a pillar of gentle golden fire rose into the winter sky, reaching up to the clouds. Not a fire, a beacon. Pariah showed the way. The first to lay down his weapon was a gray-haired veteran of 3 wars from the front rank. He thrust his spear into the snow, removed his helmet, and walked toward the fire. His 100 followed him, then 1,000. Osmond roared and hacked at the fleeing enemy until his own knights hung limp in his arms. The foreign mages assessed the situation faster than anyone else. The eldest among them threw up a white handkerchief and, in a fine southern dialect, shouted to the sky that the contract with the crown was terminated due to circumstances beyond their control. Aili Ra laughed so hard that the snow fell from the mountain ridges. By sunset, the king's army had ceased to exist. 7,000 recruits marched north toward the fiery beacon. 3,000 laid down their weapons and returned home to the south through the newly opened passage. Taravin carefully locked Osmond and his 800 loyal knights in a stone bag with a warm spring and a supply of food until negotiations could take place. Not a single person died. Caden's panel glowed. A bloodless victory over a superior force. Harmony 71. Lord level 24. Rumors spread among the people about the event, which they called the Stand at Wolf's Gate. Caden descended into the gorge to speak personally with the captive Osmond. The marshal sat in the stone sack, his brick-red face mottled with spots. Caden offered him life, freedom, and a return home on one condition: a word of honor never to raise a sword against the North again. Osmond spat at his feet and said that a word of honor is given to men, not sorcerers. Caden shrugged and left him there to sit until spring, to think. Among the 7,000 who had come to the lighthouse was a man whom Caden did not notice right away. An aging centurion named Dagmar, with a face as gnarled as an old stump. Dagmar was the last of his centuria to arrive. He was heading north and believed in nothing. He had served the crown for 30 years and knew that all lords were the same and that the land and home promised in the letter were bait for fools. He had come to see the deception up close. In Wind City, his 100 was settled into homes within 2 days. Selma's scribe personally handed him a plot of land by the Southern Canal and a charter with a seal stating that the land belonged to him and his children and that no one, not even a lord, could take it away. Dagmar read the charter 4 times. Then he went to the canal and stood on his land all day until dark. The next morning, he went to Bren and asked to join the militia as a private. Bren asked why a centurion would want to serve as a private. Dagmar replied that for the first time in 30 years, he saw something worth defending and wanted to start from the beginning. But victory in this world came at a price, and that price arrived a week later. It came from 2 sides at once. From the south, a messenger from Morven rode up with a secret letter. The chancellor wrote that the news of the stand had driven the king mad. Tedric saw in this bloodless victory not mercy, but the ultimate form of threat. A lord who need not kill to win would take the kingdom by his very existence alone. The king turned to something the crown had not turned to in 300 years. He sent men to open the black archive of the ancient empire and is searching within it for the weapon with which an ancient king once intended to wage war against the elements themselves. Morven wrote that he did not know what lay within, but he knew the archive had been sealed for a reason. And a second message arrived from below. That night, Taravin woke Caden. For the first time ever, fear appeared on the mountain's stony face. She said that the depths had spoken. While the army stood at the gates and harmony wavered, the depths tested the strength of the crack in the 5th seal. Taravin heard it with every fiber of her stone being. The voice from below sang the very same lullaby with which it had lulled her to sleep in the mines. Only now, the lullaby sounded the other way around. The voice sang, "Don't sleep." The voice sang, "Wake up and open." And the most terrifying thing, the mountain said in a whisper that made the walls tremble, was that the voice was calling her by a name she herself could not remember. There were 4 points left until Harmony 75, and Caden was driving the land toward that mark the way a horse is driven to a ford before a storm. 7,000 former recruits had to be turned into settlers, and he was doing just that. Taravin was establishing 3 villages a week. Morail was laying canals to new fields. The former soldiers took up their plows with the eagerness of people who had been forbidden to live for 30 years. Dagmar turned out to be a man of gold. He knew every squad leader in the former army, and through him, the 7,000 settled into peaceful life without a single fight. Spring thawed the rivers, and merchant caravans poured in from the south in greater numbers than ever before. The rumor of the stand did more for trade than any official decree. Merchants trusted a land where people weren't killed. By mid-spring, the panel read 74. And it stopped. Caden double-checked it every day. 74. Not a single step higher. He asked the system what the bottleneck was, and for the first time in a long while, the system gave a detailed response. The harmony of the land is composed of the well-being of its inhabitants and peace with its neighbors. A hotbed of hatred is locked away at the land's border. 800 hearts in a stone sack hate the Lord, and their hatred weighs 1 point. Caden stood gazing at that line until midnight. In the morning, he rode to the wolf gates alone, without guards or guardians. He entered the stone sack to meet Osmond and his knights, unarmed. 800 men rose to their feet at his appearance, and 800 gazes promised him death. Caden sat down on a stone opposite the marshal and did not speak of peace. He spoke of what no one had ever spoken of before. He asked Osmond if he remembered the drought 8 years ago in his county. Osmond remained silent. Caden continued. He had consulted the archives. During that drought, Osmond's county had lost 2,000 souls to starvation. The crown had provided not a single grain because Osmond had refused to comply with the tax decree that year. The count sold the family silver and bought bread from seafaring merchants at triple the price. His people survived. The court knows nothing of this because the count concealed the purchase as a disgrace. Caden said he did not consider it a disgrace. He considered it the count's only deed worthy of a song. And he proposed the following. In a month, Merail will bring the great flood. The northern rivers can share their waters with the southern lands via the old imperial canal, which Tamed will clear in a week. The droughts in Osmond's county will end forever, not as the victor's mercy, but as a treaty between neighbors. There is only one price: peace and an open border. Osmond stared at the hunter for a long time. His brick-red face worked as hard as a millstone. Then he asked why the Lord would water the enemy's land. Caden replied that his land had no enemies. It had neighbors who, for the time being, were unaware of this. Osmond made a sound that, with a great deal of goodwill, could be taken as laughter. Then he stood up and extended his hand. A word of honor was given before 800 witnesses. The knights were released that same day, and they set off southward, looking back not with fear, but with the bewilderment of people whose worldview had come crashing down. A month later, the water reached the southern counties, and at the border of the Grey Realms, for the first time, it was not a checkpoint, but a fair that had sprung up. The panel flashed. Harmony 75. Access to information about the fifth seal is open. Caden gathered all his people in the main hall, and the system revealed to him what it had been hiding for a year. The text flowed across the panel in cold lines, and Caden read it aloud. At the dawn of this land's time, the primordial one fell asleep beneath it, the foremother of the elements. A being from an era when the world had not yet decided what form it would take. Her breath gave birth to hurricanes, floods, fire, and the trembling of the earth in a single, undivided breath. The world could not live alongside her, so the world put her to sleep. From her 4 breaths, the 4 lesser elements were created and sealed over her slumber. Daughters woven from their mother's power to keep her asleep. The memory of this was taken from the daughters because no child can bear the knowledge that it is a prison for the one who gave. As long as the daughters remain at peace and in balance, the seals are strong. 200 years ago, people destroyed the temples and the balance collapsed. The daughters went mad, each in her own grief, and the seals grew thin. The 5th seal is the very earth of the gray boundaries. Its barrenness was not a curse, but a petrified shield. By restoring the earth to life, the Lord strengthened the 4 seals, but softened the 5th. Life from above seeps downward like warmth through ice, and the primordial one hears life through her sleep. The hall fell silent. Alira sank to the floor, something she had never done before. Merail gripped the edge of the table, and frost crept across the wood. Pariah burned steadily and very quietly, a fire more terrifying than any real blaze. Taravin covered her face with her hands. The daughters realized they were their mother's prison. Caden finished reading the last lines. The awakening of the primordial in her current state means the recreation of the realm into primordial chaos. But the line below was stranger. The primordial state upon awakening depends on the state of the seals at the moment of awakening. Information regarding complete slumber has been lost. Information regarding an alternative outcome is fragmentary. Next came a break in the text and 3 words without explanation: harmony, encounter, choice. Pariah was the first to speak. She said in a subdued voice that it was now clear why their memories had been erased and why the ancient king had retreated. Then she asked Caden point-blank what he would do with the 4 of them now that he knew he had been strengthening the power of the prison castles. Caden glanced at the 4 guardians and answered without a pause, because the answer had formed in his mind while he was reading. He said that he did not see any castles before him. He saw 4 daughters whose sick mother was sleeping below. And if the system had left the words harmony, encounter, and choice, it meant that someone, at some point, had allowed for the possibility that one need not fight the primordial. One could meet with her, just as he had met with each of these 4. No one believed it was possible to come to an agreement with a hurricane. They reached an agreement. No one believed in the flood, the mountain, or the volcano. It worked out. Perhaps the 5th encounter is simply the most difficult hunt of his life. Alira raised her head. Miriel let go of the table. Taravin took her hands away from her face. Pariah looked at Caden, the heat in her eyes flickering. She said he was either the greatest madman of the age or the very one spoken of in the fragments. And at that very moment, Brenna's messenger ran into the hall, dust caked on his brow. News was coming from the south, one piece worse than the next. King Tedric had opened the Black Archive. Inside the archive, they found what they were looking for: an imperial weapon from the era of the wars with the elements, the Spear of the Depths. A weapon created not to pierce flesh, but the very essence of elemental beings. The ancient king intended to use this spear to break the seals and seize the power of the primordial. Tedric had other plans. Morven wrote that the king had lost both his fear and his reason. Tedric is preparing a second campaign and tells the court that if the North cannot be defeated on the battlefield, then the 4 witches of the hunter can be slain, one with each strike. Morven also added a line that made Caden reread the letter 3 times. The spear cannot be wielded with an ordinary hand. The spear requires a bearer with a claim to the land. And the king announced before the entire court that he was stripping Caden of his granted title and returning the gray boundaries to the crown. On paper, Caden's claim to the land is now contested, and the Spear of the Depths recognized Tedric as a possible bearer. That very night, Caden's panel displayed a message that made even Pariah's fire grow cold. A threat to the seals has been detected from outside. A resonance from the Spear of the Depths and a crack in the 5th seal have been detected. Attention, the primordial hears the spear. The lullaby from below has changed its tone. Taravin whispered that the voice from below was no longer singing, "Wake up." The voice from below sings, "Come to me." The war the king was now preparing was not a war of armies, and Caden reorganized everything in a single night. The Spear of the Depths does not need 12,000. The spear needs a single bearer carried to its target. This means the South will send not columns, but a spearhead. A small detachment of the finest, with the king at the heart of the formation, because only Tedric wields the spear. Since dawn, Alira has hovered over all the southern roads. Miriel has poured sensitive water into all the rivers and fords. Taravin listened for footsteps echoing through the stone 100 miles away. Pariah placed fiery beacons along the border that would flare up at the touch of foreign metal. The land of Caden had turned into one enormous ear. And that ear heard. But it did not hear what they had expected. Tedric did not cross the border. Tedric went beneath it. Morven managed to send one last letter before he was taken into custody for treason. The Chancellor wrote that not only a spear had been found in the Black Archives, maps of the Empire's deep tunnels had also been discovered there. Before retreating, the ancient king had managed to carve out a secret passage to the 5th seal from the south, bypassing the lands and the elements. The passage ran below the roots of the bone ridge, where even Tamed cannot hear, because the stone of those depths is dead and speaks not. The entrance to the tunnel lay 100 miles south of the border, in the lands the crown. Tedric, with 50 guards and a spear, had gone underground a week ago. Caden stood over the map, and for the first time ever, his men saw confusion on his face. It was impossible to intercept the king above ground. He wasn't there. It was impossible to catch up with him underground. The dead tunnels blocked the daughter's power. Aelor had nothing to breathe down there. There was no water for Mirael. There was no air for Pire's fire. Taravin, the dead stone, gives no response. The system confirmed the worst. The spear-bearer will reach the 5th seal in 9 days. When the spear strikes the cracked seal, the primordial's awakening will occur under the worst possible conditions, in a state of agony. The prognosis, the recreation of the edge and the destruction of all the seals. Below the line of the prognosis, the panel added what changed everything. There is a second path to the seal, a direct one, vertical, through the heart of the Lord's land beneath Wingrad. The path opens only with the consent of all 4 seals and the land itself. Warning: if the Lord enters the primordial's realm before the spear-bearer, he will be the first to meet her. The outcome of the encounter depends on the state of the seals and the choice of the one who meets her. The probability of a favorable outcome cannot be calculated. There is no information about previous encounters. Caden gathered everyone in the main hall and said simply, "He's going down. To meet her." The hall erupted. Bren pounded his fist on the table and demanded to go with the Lord. Selma screamed that this wasn't a hunt, but suicide. Holt silently took off his apron and stood by the door, showing that he would go even to hell itself. Dagmar said that 7,000 former recruits would lay down at the entrance, but they wouldn't let a single one pass the Lord. Caden waited out the storm and replied that not a single soldier could be taken down there. The panel is clear. The path is opened by 4 seals and the earth. That means 5 are going. Him and his 4 daughters. They're not going to fight. They're going to meet his mother. The night before the descent was the strangest night of his life. The 4 guardians came to him one by one, and each brought something of her own. Aelira flew in first, perched on the windowsill, and chattered non-stop for an hour. Then she suddenly fell silent and said softly that she had been screaming into the void for 200 years, and he was the only one who had come into her silence. If everything ends down below, she wants him to know. Her sky belongs to him. She touched his cheek with her lips, and the wind in the room smelled of thunder and honey. Mirael arrived second and said almost nothing. She simply stood beside him by the window, just as they had stood by the fountain. Then she took his hand, pressed it to her cheek, and held it there. "Water remembers everything," she said. The water remembered his hand opening the door. No matter what happened down below, that memory would never be washed away. Taravin was the third to arrive, a human-sized figure, and she brought a gift, a small stone on a string. She said it was the first stone of the wall she had built overnight around his city. As long as the stone rested on his chest, her power would keep his bones strong under any burden. She awkwardly bumped her stony forehead against his, which was as close as a mountain could come to a kiss, and left, her granite cheekbones flushing. Piriah arrived last, just before dawn. She didn't speak tenderly. She challenged him to a duel right there in the room, and they wrestled playfully, laughing until they both collapsed. Lying on the floor, she said to the ceiling that fire doesn't know how to pray, but if the fire below went out, she would burn away her memory of him because she couldn't live with that memory. So let it not go out. That's an order. In the morning, 5 people stood in the main square of Wind City. The entire city was silent around them. 23,000 people didn't say a word, but each had left their home and was standing there. The priest began to sing the hymn, and the city joined in. 23,000 voices sang to the four elements, and Caden's panel trembled before his eyes. Harmony 79. The people's love weighed more than he had thought. Taravin opened the square as one opens a palm, and a vertical shaft descended, with a staircase of living stone. 5 stepped into the depths, and the square gently closed over them. The descent took 2 days. At first, the stone of Taravin was warm and singing. Then the stone died. The walls turned gray and lifeless, and the daughters fell silent. Their power did not vanish here, but it grew thinner, like breath in the frost. At the end of the second day, the staircase ended, and the 5 emerged into a space that had no name. Not a cave, not a hall. A void the size of the sky, but only below, and filled not with darkness, but with twilight the color of pre-creation. And in the midst of this void, she slept. The primordial one was neither a giantess nor a monster. She was a curled-up figure the size of a hill, her contours flowing. For a second, she was a woman. For a second, a wave. For a second, a tongue of flame, then a mountain range, then a tornado's pillar. She was everything at once and nothing on its own. And looking at her hurt, not the eyes, but the memory. The 4 daughters stood rooted to the spot, and then a sound traveled through the void, the distant, measured clang of metal against stone. From the south, the king's detachment was breaking through the lifeless mass. According to the panel's calculations, they had less than a day left, and the sleeping figure shuddered with every strike of a distant spear. With each spasm, waves rippled throughout the void, and up above, in the world, as Caden later learned, all 4 northern provinces trembled in those very seconds. Caden took a step toward the sleeping woman, and at that moment the primordial one spoke without opening her eyes. Her voice did not carry through the air. It arose directly inside his head, like his own thought. The voice asked who was coming toward her. Was it the one with the iron that was pounding into her sleep and causing her pain, or the one who smelled of her daughters? Caden replied aloud that he was the latter. The pause lasted an eternity. Then the voice inside her head spoke words that made the 4 daughters' knees buckle. The voice said to let him come closer and show her her children. She hadn't dreamed of them in so long. She wants to see them before she decides. Will her pain wake her, or will something else? Caden led his daughters to their mother, and those were the slowest 100 steps of his life. Alira walked, and her usual wind died down to complete stillness. Mariah walked, leaving a trail of frost behind her. Taravin had shrunk to human size and clung to Caden's shoulder like a child in the dark. Pariah walked last, her flame reduced to a candle's glow. The 4 forces that held hurricanes, floods, mountains, and volcanoes in check walked toward the sleeper, afraid like little girls. At the very edge of the shifting figure, Caden stopped and spoke first because he realized his daughters would not be able to. He introduced them as one would introduce children returning from a long journey. He said, "Behold, Alira, her sigh of wind. For 200 years she cried out in grief, and now she brings rain to the fields and carries children on tornadoes, and the children squeal with joy." He said, "Behold, Mirel, her sigh of water. She was locked away and drowned, but now she quenches the thirst of 2 kingdoms, and not a single door in the north is locked without her word." He said, "Behold, Taravin, her sigh of the earth. She slept in shackled darkness among the dead, but now she raises schools overnight, and who hides beneath her skirt? The most timid goat hides beneath her skirt." He said, "Behold Pariah, her sigh of fire. She was feared and avoided for 100 miles, but now she is the heart of every hearth, and the world's finest fencing master on the crater's rim." The flowing figure froze. The seconds dragged on. And then, across the emptiness, a sound rang out that no one had expected. Laughter. The quiet laughter of a sleeper whose sleep, for the first time in an eternity, was no longer heavy. A voice inside their heads said that the breath of fire had always been the most prickly, even before birth. She squirmed. Pariah let out a sound halfway between a sob and a snort. And then the voice grew serious and heavy, like the depths themselves. The primordial spoke and revealed what even the system did not know. She had not been put to sleep during the war. That is a lie from the later chronicles. She fell asleep of her own accord. At the beginning of time, her breath tore apart the young world, and she saw that the world would not survive alongside her. Then she exhaled her 4 finest sighs, gave them all the tenderness she possessed, and lay down at the very bottom of everything so that her dreams would not kill the living. The seals were not imposed by some foreign will. The seals are her own cradle, which she asked to be built around her. And she erased her daughter's memories as well, so that her daughters would not yearn for her or try to lie down beside her. The mother wanted her children to live above, under the sun. The daughters stood there. Water streamed down Miriel's face. Sparks rolled down Pariah's face. Alira roared like a storm, and Teravan simply sank to her knees. All their 200-year-old pain was turned upside down. They were not their mother's jailers. They were her lullaby. But the voice carried on, and a chill crept into it. She slept well as long as the temples sang. Her daughters' songs from above were, to her, dreams of them. Then the song stopped, and in their place, for 200 years, the screams of maddened children poured into her sleep. Every storm of Alira, every flood of Miriel, every convulsion of Teravan, every eruption of Pariah fell into her sleep like red-hot stones. She held on so as not to wake up, because waking up from the pain meant rising not as herself, but as her pain. And then the world would end. This past year, it had become easier for her. Warm dreams returned to her sleep. In her dreams, she saw a man who came to her daughters and did not run away. She stopped clinging to sleep with her last ounce of strength and began to rest. But now iron is knocking on her cradle. A voice told her that she remembers this iron. Many centuries ago, a blade just like this had already been searching for her. It is made of rejection, of hatred for everything greater than a human being. If it strikes the seal, she will wake up in pain, and then she will no longer be herself. She will become whatever the blow makes her. And the first to suffer, without even realizing it, will be her daughters, because the seals will take the blow upon themselves. Caden asked directly how to protect her, and the voice replied that she cannot be protected. A seal cannot be sealed from within. Only the living, both above and below, can stop the spear-bearer. But there is a choice the fragment spoke of. She can try to awaken not from pain. She can try to awaken from that other thing, from warm dreams. To awaken as herself. This has never happened before, and she does not know what will come of it. For such an awakening, the moment the seal shatters, it must not be the walls that hold her. They must hold her by the hands. All 4 daughters together, surrendering their bonds to her entirely. And one living person must stand at the heart of the circle and call her by the name she herself no longer remembers, because her name was erased before all the chronicles. The voice fell silent for a moment and added one last thing. If the call does not reach her, she will awaken to the pain within the circle caused by her own children. And then no one will be saved. She leaves the decision to them, to awaken her this way, or to run upstairs and try to stop the iron. There is a quarter of a day left before the iron arrives. Caden looked at the 4 daughters. He did not give an order. This was no time for orders. Alira wiped her face and said that she had dreamed of her mother's touch for 200 years and would not let her go now, even to the ends of the earth. Mirael said quietly that she'd been a locked-up girl for all eternity and knew you couldn't leave Mom alone in the dark. Teravin rose from her knees to her full, gigantic height and said one word, "I'll hold her." Piraya's face flushed, and she muttered that whoever has to hold this little family together and let them just try to do it without her. The 4 decisions settled like 4 stones into the foundation. All that remained was the name, a name that had been erased, unknown to the system, the chronicles, or even the bearer herself. Caden sat on the edge of the void and began to think the way he did before the most difficult hunt. Not about what he didn't know, about what he did know. He knew her through her daughters. He had unraveled each daughter not through books, but through her wound and her gift. So the mother, too, could be unraveled by what she had done. And she had done one thing. She had given her children all that was best and laid herself down in the darkness so that the world might live. Caden sifted through ancient idioms, all the words for a mother, a sacrifice, and a cradle, and not a single one resonated. And then his gaze fell upon the daughters standing at the 4 corners of the world around the sleeping woman, and he realized he was looking at a name. It was not a word. The chronicles erased the word, but no one could erase the meaning itself, because that meaning had been poured into this land for 200 years. 4 sighs, 1 stillness in the middle. In the ancient language of the first guardians, whose fragments of hymns the priest had learned, such a structure was called simply, the heart that gave itself. A 5-syllable word in a dead language. The hymns began with it, and Caden heard it every evening above the temple, not knowing he was hearing a name. He stood up, and at that moment, the void shook. The distant pounding ceased. It was replaced by a screech. The panel flashed red. The spear-bearer reached the seal. 1 minute until impact. The primordial shuddered with her entire fluid body, and her edges began to darken. Caden shouted for his daughters to form a circle. The 4 elements seized the mother's flowing edges, and the world below groaned. And above, at that very hour, the sky over Wind City turned the color of pre-creation, and 23,000 people, without a word among themselves, made their way to the temple. And the gray-haired, trembling priest raised his hands, and the city began to sing a hymn that began with a 5-syllable word in a dead language. Caden stood at the heart of the circle. Through the thick air, the rumble of the singing city reached him. The clanging of spears against the seal turned into a shriek, and Caden took a deep breath and called the sleeping one by name. The name struck the void like the first ray of light into a dark house. Caden cried out the 5-syllable word in the dead language, and at that very moment, from above, through miles of stone, the rumble of 23,000 voices singing the same word rolled down. The name rang out from below and above at once. The earth and the people called out with one voice. And at the same moment, a wall burst open at the southern edge of the void. The screech of the spear reached its end. The light of torches poured through the breach in the dead stone, and King Tedric stepped into the void. He was terrifying. The march through the dead tunnels had devoured half his guard and all that remained of his sanity. The king's eyes burned white because the spear was already gnawing at him. The spear of the depths lay in his hands like a black needle as tall as a man, and the air around its tip was dying. Tedric saw a circle of the 4 elements holding a fluid figure. He saw a hunter at the heart of the circle, and he cried out that the traitor had led the witches to the very source to take everything for himself. The king did not see the cradle. The king saw the treasury. The spear swung, its tip pointing toward the seal, which was no longer at his feet but right here in the shifting body of the sleeper. The king's 23 guards froze at the breach. These men had passed through the hell of the dead tunnels, and what they had seen in the void had shattered what remained of their obedience. The eldest of them, a captain named Rollo, shouted to the king that this was no place for iron. Tedric did not even turn around. He stepped toward the circle and raised his spear. And then it all happened at once. The primordial shuddered at the proximity of the blade, and its edges turned black. The painful awakening began. Darkness rushed from the edges toward the core like rot through an apple. The four daughters screamed in four voices because the bonds were pulling everything they were out of them. Alira thinned to a mere draft. Mirail crumbled before their eyes. Teravan crumbled to dust. The flames of Piraya turned blue. They gave themselves entirely, just as they had promised. And Caden continued to call out. He called her name again and again, and in between his calls, he described everything under the sun. How the wet earth of Wind City smells after the rains, Mirail. How the children laugh as they ride the whirlwinds of Alira. How the true steel in Holt's forges under the heat of Piraya. How the walls raised by Teravan sing in the mornings. He was not calling her to battle or to judgment. He was calling her home to a set table. Darkness and the voice struggled within her fluid body. The blackness reached the middle and paused. It flinched. It recoiled. And then Tedric struck. The spear plunged downward into the fluid flesh between Teravan's arms, where the blackness was thickest. Caden saw the blow and did what a hunter does when a beast lunges at his partner. He didn't think. He stepped in the way and took the blade upon himself. The spear of the depths was forged to pierce the essence of the elements. But over the course of a year of alliances, Caden had become half-element himself. The rank of Lord of Nature meant that all four breaths flowed through his blood. The spear entered beneath his collarbone and choked on its own. It drank from him, and he was a well into which the four oceans poured. The pain was so intense that the world turned white. Caden held his ground. He stood with a black needle in his shoulder, holding it with both hands so it couldn't be pulled out, and continued to call out the name. His voice cracked and rasped, but he kept calling. Tedric pulled the spear toward himself and howled. And then light flooded the void. The primordial opened her eyes. The blackness fell away from her like husks. She did not wake to pain. She awoke in the midst of the call, hearing her name from the lips of the man who had shielded her with his body. She awoke as herself. The fluid form rose and ceased to flow. She chose a form, and the form was simple. A woman, neither young nor old, with a face in which each of those present saw something of their own mother. She looked at the four daughters hanging from her arms and touched each one's forehead with her own. The bonds, given entirely, returned to the daughters tenfold. Alira blazed like the sky. Mirail rose with a torrent. Teravan rang out like a mountain at dawn. Piraya blazed with white gold. Then the primordial turned to Caden. She pulled the spear from his shoulder with 2 fingers, as one would remove a splinter. She covered the wound with her palm, and the wound vanished. She raised the spear to her eyes and gazed long at the black spearhead. Then she clenched her fingers. The spear of the depths, a weapon from the era of wars against the elements, crumbled in her hand into gray dust, and she exhaled the dust away with a simple breath. The king remained. Tedric knelt where the recoil of the vanished spear had thrown him. The white fire had left his eyes along with the spear, and only a small, wet glimmer remained in his eyes. The primordial approached him, and everyone in the void tensed, expecting execution. There was no execution. She crouched down before the king, just as one would crouch before a fallen child, and asked him softly why he was so afraid. She said she had seen him in a dream, the boy whose father, the king, had repeatedly told him that only the one whom everyone feared could hold the throne. The boy believed it, and killed everything within himself that did not inspire fear. She said she would not punish him. The punishment was already upon him. He was a king whom no one loved, not even himself. She simply sent him home. At her nod, Teravan raised a smooth path from the lifeless stone, leading upward toward the sun. Tedric stood up and walked along it, staggering and without looking back. The guards, led by Rollo, did not follow him. Rollo removed his helmet, laid his sword on a rock, and asked Caden whether the North accepted people who felt ashamed. Caden replied that the North was built from such people. In the beginning, she let her gaze sweep over the emptiness left by the daughters and the hunter. And she said that now there would be a difficult conversation. She had awakened, and that changed everything. The world above is young and fragile, but she is who she is. She cannot simply step out and live among the fields. Her step is an earthquake. Her sigh is a storm. The seals are no longer needed, but something else is required. A new covenant between her and the world. And it will have to be made with more than just her. She listened to something within herself, and her face took on a strange expression. She said she had slept so long that the world had managed to forget more than just her name. The world had forgotten that she is not the only one here. In other corners of the earth, beneath other mountains and seas, her sisters and brothers sleep. The primal ones from other corners of the world, and her awakening rang out through the depths like a bell. They heard it. They are still asleep, but their dreams have turned in this direction. Sooner or later, one of them will wake up, and it's not certain they'll wake up as themselves. Some of them have no daughters, no land of their own, no harmony, no hunter of their own. She looked at Caden, and in her eyes was the look of a mother who had found a solution, but didn't like it. She said they all needed to go upstairs. She needed to see this land with her own eyes, and he needed to understand that his hunt hadn't ended at this cradle. His hunt was only truly beginning from here. They climbed the Teravan road for a full day, and they emerged from underground at dawn. Teravan opened up the square of Wind City, and the primordial one was the first to step into the morning light. 23,000 people who had been standing around the square for 3 days saw a woman who smelled of all 4 seasons at once. No one knew who she was, and yet every single one of them understood who she was. The crowd dropped to their knees in a wave spreading from the center to the edges. The primordial one stopped, bewildered, and asked everyone to stand up because people need their knees for work, not for her. Thus began the most extraordinary week in the history of the North. The Foremother of the Elements walked the land of Caden and learned about the world anew. She touched the bread in the bakery and wept over it because in her time, people ate roots. She stood in the school for an hour listening to the children read syllable by syllable, and her face was like that of a person who had found a treasure. She fixed the weather as she went. Wherever she passed, livestock diseases receded and old wounds stopped aching. Her daughters trailed after her, all 4 vying to show her their canals, walls, temple, and smithy, just as children show their mother their school crafts. Pariah got into a fight with Alira over who would be the first to show her the volcano, and the primordial pulled them apart by the scruff of their necks like kittens, to the laughter of the whole town. Caden watched this and felt harmony creeping upward of its own accord. The panel read 88, then 91. But at night he would sit with the primordial on the wall, and their conversations were heavy. She spoke of the sleepers. There are 5 of them at this edge of the world, besides her. The primordial of the seas sleeps beneath the Eastern Ocean, and his sleep has been troubled in recent centuries because people pour filth and blood into the ocean. The primordial of the forests sleeps beneath the southern jungles that are being cut down. The primordial of frost sleeps beneath the ice of the far north, and he has not yet been disturbed. The primordial of the sands sleeps beneath the great desert beyond the sea. And the closest of them all, the primordial of the depths, sleeps beneath the mountain range of the neighboring western kingdom of Westmark. He sleeps the worst of them all. For 300 years, Westmark has been gnawing at its mountains with mines deeper than those of the Empire, and it does so just as the ancient Empire did, with enslaved hands. The lullaby of the primordial netter has long since been replaced by the cries of the miners. He has not yet awakened only because his sleep is heavier and deeper than hers. But her awakening, heralded by the bell, shook him as well. The primordial said that, by her reckoning, the world has years, not decades, left, and if Netter awakens in pain, he will not rise as a woman standing by the cradle. He will rise as a rift across the entire West and cast Westmark into its own mines, and its neighbors will follow in a cascade. Caden asked what it would take for him to awaken as himself, and he heard the now familiar mechanism. Every primordial has its own size, its own daughters or sons. The younger elements of his land, scattered, feral, or captive. They must be found, their peace and dignity restored, gathered at the cradle, and the sleeper, whose name has been erased, must be called through the love of his land. What Caden did here blindly over the course of a year will have to be done again, this time with clear vision. And not just once. The primordial fell silent for a moment and added the most important part. Such work requires a name and a home. A lone hunter cannot handle this. Only what he has already unwittingly built can handle it. The land of the covenant, a place where people and the elements live as one community. The North must become neither a kingdom nor a fortress. The North must become a school of peace, a place from which emerge those who know how to make deals with the storms, and Caden must become neither a lord nor a king. The first in a new craft for which she had unearthed a word from a time before the Chronicles, the keeper of the cradles. While they spoke, the old order was crumbling in the south. Tedric returned to the capital alone, without a spear, without a guard, and without himself. He locked himself in the palace and did not emerge for a week. And when he did emerge, he did what no one expected. He convened the Grand Council, released Morven from prison, and, before the entire court, renounced the throne. He told the council that he had seen true power down below, and that true power had crouched before him and taken pity on him. One cannot rule with that knowledge. Tedric had no direct heirs. The council was abuzz with pretenders, and the air in the south was thick with the scent of turmoil. Morwen managed to push through the only sensible decision. Until a new king was elected, power was vested in a regency council, and the council's first act was to send an embassy to the north with a single question. What does the north want? The embassy arrived in Wind City, and Caden gave an answer that left them wide-eyed as they carried it back south. The North does not want the throne. The North will neither secede nor join the Empire. The North proposes a treaty of equals to the South. Open borders, shared waterways, a shared canal, and a joint court for disputed matters. And one request in return. The South will hand over to the North all imperial archives concerning the elements and will not interfere with the North's direct dealings with other countries. Morven, reading this letter in the capital, laughed for the first time in a year. Once again, the hunter had refused what was offered to him, and once again, he received more than he had asked for. The council signed everything. Meanwhile, in Vetrogard, a question arose that had caused Caden to flee longer than he had from any army. Selma raised the issue in front of everyone during a communal dinner in the stone house. She said that the land needed not only a guardian, but also a line of succession, and that the 4 guardians hadn't been young girls for 300 years. They were circling around the Lord while he pretended to be busy. The room fell silent. Illyra turned crimson and fled up the chimney. Mira's L vanished into a water jug, body and all. Teravin hid behind the stove, but couldn't fit, and knocked down half the wall. Piraya was the only one left sitting there. She folded her arms and said that the grasshopper was right, and that she had been the first to claim her rights, even back at the crater. But some people were just deaf. A heated argument broke out, one that nearly tore the house apart, and the primordial one put an end to it with a single phrase. She told her daughters that the elements do not divide. The elements complement one another. The wind isn't jealous of the water. The water isn't jealous of the fire. That is their nature, and it's foolish to live contrary to nature. And the hunter has a heart as big as this land. She saw it from within when he held his spear. There's enough room for all four of them, if the hunter himself agrees. All 5 women, the 4 daughters and their mother, turned to Caden. Caden, who hadn't flinched in the face of the basilisk, the hurricane, or the awakening of the primordial mother of the world, stood up and said he urgently needed to check the outposts. The laughter was so loud that in Wind City they assumed a wedding was being celebrated somewhere. In fact, they were almost right. And a day later, after laughing and running off, Caden gathered the 4 of them at the edge of the crater, the very spot where he'd once had his most honest conversation with fire. And he spoke simple words to them, with no witnesses present. He is a hunter and does not know how to lie. He came to love each of the 4 as he came to understand them. Wind for laughter, water for depth, stone for loyalty, fire for honesty. He doesn't know what such a family is called under human laws, but his land itself writes laws that have never existed before. If they agree to be not a harem serving a lord, but 4 equal mistresses of this house and this land, then he is theirs, entirely. Their answer to him was 4 yeses spoken in unison and a single kiss in 4 turns, from which the northern lights rose above the crater in broad daylight. The wedding was set for the day of the summer solstice, and the morning after the engagement, Illyra returned from a patrol flight as white as the winter sky. The wind brought from the west, from beyond the west mark, a scent she had never smelled before but recognized through her blood. The scent of a stranger's deep-seated rage. And the wind also brought news, simpler and worse. Westmark had learned of the awakening and of the shattered spear. And the king of Westmark, Gundurek the Iron, drew his own conclusion from this. He ordered his miners to dig deeper. He decided that the same power lay beneath his mountains, and he would be the first to claim it. Caden stood on the wall, looking west, and realized that the time frame the primordial had measured in years, Gundurek had just shortened with his own hands. Caden began where he always began, with the knowledge of the beast. The imperial archives, which had arrived from the south in 3 wagon trains, were stored in the new stone library, and 20 scribes under the priest's supervision pored over them day and night for a month. The picture that emerged of Westmark was a grim one. The kingdom beyond the mountain range lived by the mountain and the mountain alone. Silver, iron, and gemstones. A third of the population was, in one way or another, tied to the mines. Debt-bound laborers, convicts, and peasants sold to pay taxes. Gundurek the Iron ruled for 20 years, propped up by 3 pillars, the Guild of Ore Barons, the army, and fear. And in the oldest imperial documents, something was found that would have made the primordial turn pale, if she were capable of turning pale. The Empire knew of the primordial of the depths. The Empire had discovered his size, the 4 younger spirits of the Western Mountains, and the Empire did to them what it had not managed to do here. It did not kill them. It harnessed them. Ancient engineers forged 4 relic yokes and placed them upon the spirits, forcing their power to labor in the mines. The spirit of the ore veins sought out metal. The spirit of the underground waters drained the tunnels. The spirit of the stony firmament held up the vaults. The spirit of the deep heat melted the rock. The empire fell, but the yokes remained and were passed down to the ore barons of Westmark, who for 300 years have regarded the harnessed spirits as mere family property and do not even know whom they are keeping. That is why Nedra sleeps with a scream. His children have been in harness for 300 years. Elira listened to this reading and trembled. Mirail froze the inkwell right through. Pariah burned a hole in the table. Teravin said only one thing: "Let's go and take them down." Caden calmed everyone down and laid out the plan. "We can't break in by force. Westmark isn't Osman's squad. An army of 80,000, mountain fortresses, and most importantly, spirits in yokes. According to imperial records, the yoke turns a spirit into its master's weapon. If the North comes to war, the barons will turn the harnessed children of Nedra against his own nieces, and the elements will tear the elements apart. From such a battle, Nedra will awaken in pain in the midst of the battle, and then it will be the end for all. So we must proceed differently, as I have always done, with a small force, guided by knowledge, and through the people." The panel seemed to have been waiting for this decision. It swiveled and revealed what it had never shown before: a mission beyond the territory, the liberation of the 4 breaths of the underworld. The condition: the yoke cannot be removed by external force. The yoke falls if the master of the yoke releases the spirit through his own will, or if the spirit itself ceases to believe in the master's right. The reward is unknown. The note at the bottom stated that the Watcher's system was expanding its scope of operation. They gathered quickly. Caden took Pariah with him because a Western crucible cannot exist without fire, as well as Dagmara and Rollo, who had the faces of mercenaries and the habits of warriors. Teravin, Mirail, and Elira remained to hold the north, and this was a battle in itself as they said their goodbyes. The original one remained as well. Her approach over the ridge would have alarmed the Nether before its time. She kissed Caden on the forehead and said she would have given any of the mountains for him, but he didn't need the mountains. He did everything without them. They entered Westmark disguised as merchants of northern steel. Holt Steel opened any door in the west better than lockpicks. For 3 weeks, Caden wandered through the mining towns, watching and listening. What he saw was worse than anything in the archives. The towns were black with soot. Workers descended into the mines at the sound of a bell and came back up every other day. Children as young as 6 were put to work sorting ore. And in the main mine of the barony of Morngate, beneath Mount Zubetz, lived the spirit of the ore veins, and Caden saw it. The Baron of Morngate staged a display of a family heirloom for his wealthy guests. In the hall, behind a grill of imperial metal, stood a young man woven from dull gold, with a yoke around his neck in the form of a ring of black iron. The young man's eyes were as empty as a mined-out tunnel. At the Baron's command, he pointed with his hand toward the locations of new veins, and the guests clapped. Pariah, in the crowd of guests, kept a straight face, and behind Caden's back, a cloak smoldered. That night at the inn, she said that if they didn't remove that ring, she would personally declare war on the West. Caden replied that the ring would be removed. But it wouldn't be her or him who removed it. Westmark would remove it, with his own hands. The plan he laid out was as long as winter and as brazen as everything he ever did. The yoke falls if the spirit stops believing in the master's right, or if the master lets it go of his own accord. So 2 things must be done: show the spirits that things can be different, and make it so that keeping the spirits becomes more costly for the masters than letting them go. The first was Pariah's task. She began visiting the harnessed ones at night through chimney flues and mine shafts, because there are no locks for fire where there is heat. She couldn't remove the yoke. She would sit down beside them and tell stories about the North, about her sisters, about her mother who had awakened at the sound of a name, about the hunter who comes and does not flee. The spirit of the ore veins listened in silence for a month. Then, for the first time in 300 years, it asked her if it were true that somewhere the elements were asked for consent. The second was Caden's doing. and it later found its way into all the textbooks of the West under the title Steel Winter. The North announced that it would sell its steel everywhere except in the ore baronies where forced labor existed. And to any barony that switched its workers to free hire and decent wages, the North would provide steel, tools, and mining instructors free of charge for 5 years. The West's economy was thrown into turmoil. Northern steel was twice as good as Westmark steel, and 3 times cheaper, 3 times as cheap, because it was forged by the heat of pariah rather than by burning forests. Within a month, small baronies were flocking to the North's offer. Their mines, staffed by free workers and equipped with northern tools, began to yield more than their neighbors' slave labor pits. The major barons howled and rushed the Gundarek to demand war against northern trade, and workers throughout Westmark began asking questions out loud. What happened next was both what Caden had anticipated and what he had not. The anticipated part: Gundarek banned northern steel and sent troops into the restless mining towns, thereby turning both the poorer barons and the workers against him at once. The unanticipated part: in Moorgate, during the suppression of the unrest, soldiers fired into the crowd at the mine gates and killed 11 miners. And the spirit of the ore-dwellers, who had stood caged above that mine for 300 years, raised its head of its own accord for the first time without being ordered to do so. It watched through the bars as the dead were carried away. And then the black yoke around its neck cracked, not from an outside force, but because the spirit's faith in the right of its master had died at that very moment. That same night, Mount Zubets trembled, once, like a heart that had skipped a beat. And in the north, beyond the ridge, Iznachelnaya awoke in the middle of the night, sat up in bed, and said into the darkness that her brother downstairs had opened one eye in his sleep. After Zubets Mountain's first tremor, events came crashing down like a rockslide. Gundarek the Iron was many things, but he was no fool. For a month, his secret service had been pulling the strings of Steel Winter for a month, and the threads converged on 4 northern steel merchants. In a single night, arrests of northern merchants swept through all the cities of the West, and in Moorgate, Dagmar and Rollo were taken right from the inn. Caden and Pariah were saved by their hunter's instincts. That night, they had spent the night not in the city, but by the furnace of an abandoned smelter, where Pariah had spoken with the spirit of the deep heat. In the morning, heralds declared the northerners to be spies and instigators of unrest, and the king of Westmark declared war on the north. An army of 80,000 received orders to march over the mountain range. At the same time, Gundarek made a move that showed he understood everything about the spirits. His men bought out and transported all 4 relic yokes, along with the spirits, to the capital at Mount Royal Fang. Gundarek announced to the barons that the family games were over. From now on, the 4 spirits were weapons of the crown. He positioned them on the walls of his mountain capital just as one would position ballistas. The spirit of the Stony Realm was to bring the mountain passes crashing down upon the northern army. The spirit of underground waters was to flood the valleys. The spirit of ore veins was to tear apart the enemy's iron. The spirit of heat was to burn. The war of the elements, which Caden wanted to avoid more than anything, was upon them. And worst of all was what Gundarek did not know. The Royal Fang was not just a mountain. According to imperial maps, it was the crown of a sleeping giant. Directly beneath the capital of Westmark lay the head of the primordial depths. Gundarek was positioning cannons on the sleeping giant's forehead and preparing to fire from there. Caden sent a messenger north via the fire of Pariah, because the flames of the north and the flames of the south are of the same blood, and a message traveled faster through the mountains than any messenger. The message carried 3 orders. The northern army was not to approach the ridge by even a mile. The daughters were to stay at home no matter what they heard. The eldest was to prepare what they had discussed the previous night. As for himself, he set out with Pariah for the capital of Westmark. Just the two of them. Into a city besieged by troops where their faces hung on the city gates. They made their way through the mountains. Pariah blazed a trail that no one had ever taken, from smelter to smelter, from forge to forge, through the fiery veins of the west. For the Lord of Nature, in union with fire, the heat was a door. A week later, they emerged from the cooled furnace in the capital's blacksmith's quarter, half a mile from the palace. Dagmara and Rollo were being held in the palace prison, and the first thing Kaiden did was free them, because a hunter never abandons his partners. He rescued them without a fight. Half the capital's prison guard consisted of veterans from the ore garrisons, and among them, after Morngate, there were plenty who felt ashamed. For 3 weeks, Rollo spoke with his cellmates and the guards in the way that only old soldiers know how to speak. When Kaiden approached the prison at night, the doors were opened for him from the inside. The final night of Old Westmark had begun, and it was unfolding not according to plan, but beyond it. Gunderic received a report about the escape and the northerners in the city and lost his temper. He decided to demonstrate his power to the rebels immediately. He ordered the spirit of the stone fortress to be brought out to the palace square, and before the eyes of the gathered city, commanded him to bring down the quarter where the fugitives were hiding. An exemplary execution of an entire quarter. The spirit was brought out. The woman of gray stone wearing a black yoke was placed in front of the square, and the king gave the order from the balcony. And nothing happened. The spirit of the stone fortress stood there, staring at the quarter she was supposed to destroy. Blacksmiths lived in that quarter. For 300 years she had held up the vaults above the miners, and for 300 years she had heard their breath through the stone. She could have been made to force them to mine ore and reinforce the tunnels. But now the yoke commanded her to kill the blacksmith's sleeping children, and within her, the very thing upon which the entire imperial harness was based snapped with a crash, the belief that the master had the right. Gunderic repeated the order. The yoke around the stone woman's neck burst in two with a clang that the whole city heard, and one after another, as if on a string, the remaining 3 snapped. In the palace's dungeons, the ring of the spirit of waters burst apart. On the wall, the yoke of the spirit of heat crumbled. And in the throne room's treasury, the yoke of the spirit of ore veins scattered, a crack that had been waiting for its hour since Morngate. The empires the yokes with a single chain, and the chain died entirely. 4 liberated sighs of the underworld rose above the capital of Westmark. For 300 years, the yoke had been drawn from them by grief and anger, and the city screamed in horror because now nothing held them back. The spirit of water rose as a black pillar above the palace. The spirit of heat blazed above the wall with an evil white light. The earth rippled in waves. The awakened fury of the children struck the sleeping father right on the crown of his head. The royal fang rumbled from within. The primordial netter was awakening, and he was awakening in pain. And then a single unarmed man stepped out onto the palace square of Westmark and raised his hands. Kaiden shouted to the 4 enraged spirits the only thing that could stop them. Not a command, a name. He shouted that he knew their father, that their father was sleeping right beneath their feet and could hear them. For 300 years he had heard their cries, and now he heard their fury. And if they struck the city, their father would rise up in their fury and not recognize them. He shouted that he had come from the south, their sister of fire, and from the north, their aunt who had awakened through love, and that things can be different. He is a hunter from the other side of the ridge, and he is a witness. It can be different. 4 spirits froze above the square, which was thrashing in panic. And in the silence that followed, Pariah emerged from the forge in the blacksmith's quarter. The fire of the north stood beside the man and spoke to the fire of the west in a language no ear had ever heard. And then what happened was recorded in all the chronicles of both kingdoms. Across the pass, through the night sky, came the primordial one. She walked through the air as if on a road, for the three daughters from the north were carrying her. The wind kept her pace, the water smoothed her path, and the stone sang to her like a bridge. She stepped onto the square of Westmark, knelt down, and pressed her palms against the cobblestones, against the crown of her sleeping brother's head. And she began to sing. She sang a lullaby in reverse, the very same one whose depths had once awakened Teravin, only now turned toward rest. She sang to her brother through the stone that his children were free, that the yoke is dead, that the pain is over. The rumble in the mountains slowed. The four spirits of the west listened to the song about themselves and descended onto the square one by one, like falling ash. The spirit of the ore veins, a golden youth with dead eyes, approached the primordial one, and his eyes came alive. He lay down beside her on the cobblestones, pressed his ear to the stone, and wept. For the first time in 300 years, he had heard not a command, but his father's voice. The mountain grew still. The primordial of the depths did not awaken that night. He ceased to see the bad dream, and his breathing evened out. His awakening receded, not cancelled, but postponed until the day when he would be roused as he ought to be. Gunderic the Iron still had his army and his throne, but he lacked what mattered most. That night, his entire city saw who had saved him from the wrath of the elements. Not the king. A barefoot woman from the north singing to a stone, and a hunter with his hands raised. The next morning, the guard refused to carry out orders to go to war. By noon, the barons demanded that the great mountain Ting be convened. By evening, Gunderic the Iron had laid his crown upon the cathedral's altar himself, for the iron within him was true, and he knew how to recognize when a blade was broken. And Caden stood in the midst of a foreign capital, gazing at the four liberated spirits and the mountain sleeping at his feet, and realized that now the hardest part was just beginning. Not to break the old world, but to build a new one. The great mountain thing of Westmark sat for 40 days, and the world that emerged from those 40 days was no longer like the one before. Caden sat at the Ting, not as a judge or a victor, but as an invited witness, and spoke rarely. He had learned this over the course of 2 years. You cannot build a foreign world for others. You can only show that things can be different, and then step aside. Westmark chose, in place of a crown, a council of the lands and a mining law copied word for word from the Terrawin statute. From now on, not a single mine would be dug by a slave's hand. The four liberated spirits of the West came to the Ting of their own accord on the final day and offered the mountains a treaty. They would remain at the mines, not in bondage, but in alliance. The spirit of the ore veins will point out the veins where mining will not harm the father. The spirit of the waters will divert water away from the tunnels. The spirit of the earth will hold up the vaults. The spirit of heat will give the smelting furnaces a pure flame. There is but one price. The voice of the spirits is equal to the voice of the lands in the council, and the day of the winter solstice is declared a day of silence, when all the mines fall silent and the mountains sing to the sleeper. The Ting rose and accepted the treaty while standing. Thus, the primordial of the depths came to possess what his sister had, his own land covenant, his own cradle, held not by seals, but by the living. Caden returned home in the spring, crossing the pass, and reined in his horse on the crest of the ridge. Behind him lay the west, where darkness receded from the mining towns. Ahead lay the north, and the sight took his breath away, even though he had seen it with his own eyes and helped create it with his own hands. The gray boundaries were no longer gray. Fields stretched green to the horizon. The canals of Mirael glistened. The cities raised by Tamed gleamed white. The wind danced above the temple, and even the harem volcano smoldered with steady, gentle smoke, like a stove in a cozy home. The panel unfolded on its own and displayed the line he had been waiting for 2 years. Earth's harmony. 100 out of 100. Complete equilibrium achieved. The territory of the Gray Frontiers has been renamed by decision of the inhabitants. The new name is 5 Lands. Below, a line he hadn't asked for glowed. The rank of Guardian of the Cradles has been confirmed by deeds. The system of natural dominion has fulfilled its purpose and its authority to the bearer. Further decisions are made by a human, not by the system. Farewell, Lord Caden. The panel closed and never opened again. Caden sat in the saddle and laughed. The system that had once driven him with deadlines and threats had departed, just as a guide departs after leading a traveler home. From there on, he went his own way. He had always gone his own way. The wedding took place on the day of the summer solstice, and neither this world nor its neighbors had ever seen a wedding like it. In the main square of the 5 Lands, tables were set for 40,000 guests. Morven arrived from the south. He had become the first chancellor of the Union Treaty and brought gifts from the Regency Council. From the west came envoys from the Mountain Ting and the 4 spirits of the underworld with a gift from the Sleeper. The golden youth of the Orvanes presented Caden with a simple iron ring, saying that his father had seen him in a dream and asked to convey that iron could be like this too. Osmond arrived uninvited, bringing 100 barrels of southern wine, and spent the entire evening arguing with Bren over whose cavalry had been worse in their day. Dagmar and Rollo stood as the honor guard. Holt forged 4 crowns. Selma had been crying since morning and told everyone that she had been the first to predict this. 5 stood before the altar of the Temple of the 4 Winds, Caden and his 4 brides. Elira in a dress of summer sky. Mirael in a dress of river silk. Taravin, as tall as a human, in a gown of white stone finer than lace. Piriah in flames shaped into a dress, for true fire does not pretend to be fabric. The primordial one herself wed them, and she drew the words of the rite not from human books, but from times before the chronicles. She asked the 4 daughters if they would take this man as their husbands and guardians, just as the earth takes the grain forever and without reserve. 4 yeses rang out like the 4 seasons. She asked Caden if he would take the 4 elements as his wives and guardians, just as a hunter follows a trail to the end of the path. Caden replied that the trail had been taken long ago, and he would not stray from it. Then the primordial joined the 5 hands into one, and declared to the city and the world that from now on, this was not a union between a man and the elements. It was a family. And let anyone who doubts that storms can be loved come to the 5 Lands and see for themselves. They feasted for 3 days. On the 2nd day, Elira took the guests for rides on Mirel's tamed tornadoes. Mirel had Taravin wine flowing through the canals. Gottfried and she set up the guest quarters overnight, and Perea put on such a fireworks display that the 3 kingdoms decided the North must be celebrating something else and, just in case, sent their congratulations. The years after the wedding flew by like the good old days, and they still do, swiftly and fully. The 5 Lands became what the primordial one had named them, the School of the World. People came from all corners of the world to study here. Mountain craftsmen from the west, shipbuilders from the east, whose elders were already listening with alarm to the ominous dreams of their ocean. Envoys from the southern jungles. Caden selected not the strongest, but the most attentive among the newcomers and taught them his craft, to read the beast, to hear the wound behind the fury, to arrive and not flee. 5 years later, the first watchman set out eastward toward the sleeping sea, carrying maps from the archives and orders to begin not with the spirit, but with the people who pour filth into the ocean. 7 years later, a second outpost of watchmen was established at the southern jungles. The world was slowly turning its face toward its sleepers. And in the 5 lands, life went on as usual, and the stone house grew ever more cramped and ever merrier. Perea was the first to give birth to a daughter with embers in her eyes, who set her cradle ablaze on the 3rd day of her life, and Holt forged an iron one for her. Then Mirail gave birth to a son still as a whirlpool, who at 1 year old learned to breathe underwater before he could walk. Alira's daughter was born during a thunderstorm, and her first word was sky. Teravin carried her child longer than anyone else, as grief should, and gave birth to twins as calm and heavy as 2 boulders, and the primordial nursed her grandchildren, all 4 elements at once, and said that for this alone it was worth sleeping through an era. The children grew up half human, half Psy, and for the first time, the world looked upon them not with fear, but with hope, because they were the children of a treaty, not of war. As for Caden himself, he grew old the way hunters do. He did not weaken, but grew quiet. On the 20th anniversary of the 5 lands, he climbed to the rim of the crater, alone, just as he always did when he wanted to think. Below lay his land, cities and fields, temples and schools, canals and roads. 40 years ago, people were exiled here to die. Now they came here to learn how to live. He recalled the throne room and the laughter of the nobility, the laughter of those who had handed him a death sentence wrapped in gold. Of that entire court, no one remained in power, yet his land stood and would continue to stand because it was not built on fear. He heard footsteps behind him, but did not turn around because he recognized all 4 gates. Wind to his right, water to his left, stone behind him, fire, as always, right beside him. The primordial one approached silently from behind and stood beside him, looking down at the earth that had been her cradle and had become her home. Piraya asked what he was thinking about all these years later. Caden didn't answer right away. He said he was thinking about the word with which they had once sought to curse him. He was given barren land in the hope that the land would kill him. But there is no such thing as barren land. There are lands that no one has asked why they weep. There are storms that no one has called by name. His entire life had been summed up in one simple rule, and this rule he would leave to his children and guardians after him. Before you fight the elements, ask them what they're screaming about. Before you build a wall, open the door. Before you call something a disaster, learn its name. The sun was setting behind the mountain range, and the 4 elements sat beside their man on the warm rim of a dormant volcano. Below, the windows of the 5 lands were lighting up. In the temple, the evening hymn began, and the 5-syllable word with which it began floated over the land where man and storm finally lived as one family. The story of the hunter who tamed the calamities was told to the very end, because he hadn't tamed them. He had listened to them, and that was enough to change the world. Chancellor Morven stood in the throne room and counted the candles. He always counted something when the court was doing something foolish. There were 216 candles. There was one big blunder. Morven was 62 years old. He had spent 40 of those years among the archives and the throne. He had started as a young scribe in the royal repository and still remembered the smell of old leather and dust better than the smell of his own home. No one at court knew the archives as well as he did. And no one at court knew what he knew about the gray borders. 23 years ago, Morven, then a young archivist, was clearing the rubble after a fire in the northern wing of the repository. In a charred chest with no inventory list, he found a report from an ancient imperial expedition. The report was incomplete. Half the pages crumbled in his hands. But he read the surviving pages by candlelight behind a locked door, and then didn't sleep for 3 nights. The report stated that the barrenness of the northern lands was not a curse. The report mentioned the word seal. One page of the report was torn off at the phrase stating that, if events unfolded correctly, an encounter and a choice would be possible. Beyond that lay only ashes. Morven copied the surviving portion by hand, hid the copy, and didn't say a word to anyone. He was young, but already understood the main rule of survival at court. Knowledge of great power kills those who share it before their time. Ever since then, he had been waiting. He couldn't explain what for. He simply went through the lists of the kingdom's heroes every year, and each time set the lists aside with a sigh. Not the one. Not the one. None of them were the one. And then the hunter Caden single-handedly killed the ancient basilisk. Morven picked up his papers that very evening. An orphan. 12 years of hunting in the most treacherous corners of the kingdom. Not a single unfulfilled contract. Not a single complaint from clients. And one oddity that no one but the archivist would have noticed. Over the course of 12 years, the hunter had paid out of his own pocket 7 times for access to the provincial archives. A hunter who reads documents before a hunt. Morven set his sheet aside. From there, events unfolded in a way Morven hadn't planned, but the further they went, the less he interfered. The court was frightened of the hero. The law required granting him land and a title, but Osmond's faction whispered that elevating a man of no lineage was dangerous and that there were reliable poisons. Morwen heard these whispers with his own ears at the small council. And then he made his first move, one that no one ever found out about. He presented the king with an idea that was both elegant and effective. Why use poison when there are the gray boundaries? The law was upheld. The hero was rewarded. The problem would resolve itself in a single winter. Tedric laughed for a quarter of an hour and embraced the chancellor around the shoulders. Osmond's faction gritted their teeth because the poison had been their doing, while the limits had become Morven's achievement. As for Morven himself, he walked home that evening, unsure why he'd done it. He told himself he'd saved a man from poison. He didn't admit to himself that for 23 years he'd been waiting for an excuse to send someone worthy of that door from the charred report. 4 days before the ceremony, the night watchman of the repository reported to Morven that a man in a wyvern skin jacket had been sitting in the archive's main hall for the 3rd night in a row, reading the land codes. The watchman asked if he should be turned away. Morven asked what exactly the man was reading. The guard replied that the man had requested the tax codes for the past 200 years. Morven paused and ordered not to chase him away, and to give the man a better lamp because it was dark in the main hall. He set down the receiver of the speaking tube and sat motionless for a long time. The hunter prepared for the reward as he would for a hunt. So the hunter had figured out something about the beast called the court. On the day of the ceremony, Morven stood by the throne, looking not at the king, but at the hunter. When the hall burst into laughter, Morven leaned toward his neighbor and said that the hunter would now fall to his knees and beg for another land. He said it loudly and foolishly. He said it on purpose. 40 years at court had taught him that the best way to hide one's interest is to show contempt. And when the hunter began speaking of judicial authority, of 15 years without taxes, and of the code regarding wastelands, Morven turned pale, truly pale, without any pretense. Not out of surprise, out of precision. The hunter had selected from the 200-year-old code precisely the 3 articles that Morven himself would have chosen. Not a single one too many, not a single one omitted. Standing behind the king, who was grinding his teeth, the chancellor experienced a feeling he hadn't felt in 30 years. He felt hope, and it was as uncomfortable as a new pair of boots. That evening, after the ceremony, a man from Osmundo's party came to Morven and proposed a simple solution. The hunter would travel north through the Raven Forest. There are bandits in the Raven Forest. Morven listened, nodding. Then he reminded his guest that the murder of a knighted lord on the royal road was a case of treason, and cases of treason were handled by the chancellery, that is, by him personally. The guest left, pale-faced. The next morning, Morven sent 200 gamekeepers into the Raven Forest under the pretext of a raid on poachers. The raid lasted exactly the 10 days it took the hunter's caravan to pass straight through the forest. Neither the king, nor Osmond, nor Caden himself found out about this. The chancellor knew how to make his good deeds look like a boring routine. Then 20 days of silence fell over the north. Morven worked, held meetings, and signed documents. And every evening he would take his old copy of the scorched report out of its hiding place and reread the truncated phrase about the meeting and the choice. He caught himself waiting for news from the north for the first time in many years, not as a bureaucrat, but as a gambler who had staked something more than money. The first news arrived a month and a half later from a merchant with a salt caravan. The merchant swore he'd seen, from the pass, a clear sky over the cursed plain. The court laughed at the merchant. Morven paid the merchant and ordered him to keep quiet. The second report came via a fur trader. The whirlwinds had subsided. There was a camp on the plain, and people were heading there. The court laughed again, but more quietly this time. Morven locked the door to his study, sat down over his scorched manuscript, and for the first time spoke aloud what he'd been afraid to think. The seals had come to life. The door began to open, and no one in this kingdom but him understood that one shouldn't laugh at merchants. One shouldn't laugh at all. One must look very quietly and very carefully toward the north and pray to all the gods that the man in the wyvern skin jacket turns out to be the one who opens the doors and not the one who breaks them down. Because the torn page of the imperial report had another surviving line that Morven did not like to recall. The line stated that the ancient king had retreated from the boundaries not out of fear of the elements. The ancient king retreated after his court astrologer died of a broken heart, having managed to write down a single sentence. The astrologer wrote that he had peered into the depths beneath the seals, and the depths had looked back at him. Morven personally selected the inspector for the north, choosing him as one would choose a surgeon. The court wanted to send a member of Osmundo's party who would bring back a pre-written report on the barren wasteland. At the council meeting, Morven yawned and said it would be a waste of a good man on dead land, and proposed Fabian. The court agreed readily because Fabian was considered a good-for-nothing. Fabian was boring, meticulous, and pathologically incapable of lying in official documents. Because of this inability, he hadn't been promoted in 20 years. It was precisely because of this that Morven sent him. The chancellor did not need a spy. The chancellor needed a witness whose story he would believe. While Fabian was traveling north, Morven went about his usual behind-the-scenes work. He was stalling. Osmond's party was already demanding a military expedition against the self-proclaimed sorcerer. Morven didn't argue. Morven agreed and bogged the matter down in red tape. The budget proposal for the campaign came back from his office with 43 clarifying questions. The registry of supply wagons required cross-checking with the registry of wheelwrights. The request for oats was sent to the tax chamber for approval and got lost there. No one could accuse the chancellor of treason. The chancellor was impeccably slow. Fabian's report landed on the king's desk on the same day as Osmond's letter about the flood, and this coincidence was no accident. Osmond's messenger was detained at the outpost for 2 days due to an incorrect travel permit. The travel permits at that outpost were checked by a man who received a second salary from Morwen's personal funds. The chancellor wanted the king to read both documents at once and see not a miracle or a neighbor's grievance in isolation, but the whole picture. The plan backfired. Morven had underestimated fear. Tedric read about the living rivers and walls overnight and spoke of a vassal who posed a threat to the crown. Morven stood nearby, and something inside him snapped. He knew that tone. It was in that very tone that, 20 years ago, Tedric had ordered the execution of his own uncle for a campaign that had been too successful. That evening, the Chancellor did something he had never done before. He volunteered to lead the embassy north himself. The court was astonished. The kingdom's foremost dignitary was traveling to the wasteland to meet a rootless upstart. Morven explained it this way at the council. The matter was too serious for lower-ranking officials. To himself, he explained it differently. He had waited 23 years to see an open door, and he could wait no longer. The journey north was difficult for the old man, but he crossed the Kostya Ridge without feeling his body. Below lay what he would see for the rest of his life whenever he closed his eyes: cities of white stone, water in the canals, a girl emerging from the wind above the temple. Morven rode through the gates carved from solid rock, and his face did not flicker even once. It cost him more effort than all the diplomacy of his life had ever required. He read the demand for the transfer of the spirits in an even voice, hating every word. He uttered the word property and felt the air in the hall grow thick and a small, malevolent whirlwind form beneath the ceiling. In that second, the Chancellor understood something he would later be unable to explain to a single person in the South. These four creatures could not be taken away from the hunter, not because they were strong. They could not be taken away because they loved him. There are ways to counter strength. Against this, there are no techniques. Caden invited him to stay for a week, and Morven stayed, feeling a sense of relief that he carefully concealed. Officially, he was observing. In reality, he was watching intently and filling in the gaps from 23 years ago. He walked through Wind City without an entourage. He spoke with old women at the wells, with blacksmiths, and with former convicts. He was looking for what he had been searching for his whole life at the courts: fear, a hidden agenda, a hidden price. He found nothing. He found something else. At Selma's sanatorium, he saw a certificate on the wall granting a land allotment to a legless veteran and memorized it word for word. At the school, he listened for half an hour as the children read syllable by syllable and left before anyone noticed his tear-filled eyes. He stood by the memorial fountain in the drained valley for the entire evening. Someone told him a story about a lock-keeper and a locked-up girl. Morven listened and thought of his late wife. No one at court knew about this. The Chancellor's wife, Ingrid, a quiet northern woman, was the granddaughter of exiles from the Grey Borders. Her grandfather had been sent here for debts and had vanished in the storms. Ingrid had prayed for this land her whole life, just as one prays for a grave that cannot be visited. She had died 9 years ago. Morven stood by a fountain in a foreign city and spoke to her for the first time in 9 years. He told her that her grandfather's land had come back to life. The night before leaving for the volcano, he asked Kaiden for that private conversation, which he later recalled as the most important conversation of his life. But only the conclusion remained in the original chronicles. The beginning remained between the two of them. And it began when the old Chancellor laid a scorched copy of the imperial report on the table in front of the hunter. His secret, 23 years in the making. He said he was not giving this to the crown or to the Lord. He was giving it to the man who opens doors. And he added that if there truly is a meeting and a choice in the depths, then let the one who knows how to ask the storms what they are screaming about be the one to choose. Kaiden read the scorched lines for a long time. Then he asked why the Chancellor had remained silent his entire life. Morven answered honestly, because he had watched kings up close his entire life, and he knew that any one of them, upon reading this, would start digging. To a king, the word seal sounds like the word lock on a treasure chest. Then there was the volcano. Morven stood on the wall and watched as a golden glow rose over Hargrim and as hearths lit up of their own accord throughout the city. He had been calculating his whole life, and now he calculated once more. he concluded that he was witnessing a power next to which all the armies of the continent were mere child's play, and that this power had just chosen to be the heart of the hearth rather than the fire itself. Such a thing defied every science of power he knew. In his old age, he had to establish a new science. That very evening, he warned Kaiden about the threat from the south and the Black Archive, and this was recorded in the chronicles. Nothing else remained in the chronicles. As he took his leave at the gates, Morven did something he had never done before for any sovereign. He bowed to the hunter at the waist. And he asked for one thing. If one day in the north they were to hold a funeral service for the nameless exiles who perished in the old storms, let them also remember, at the same time, the servant of God Tormod, his wife's grandfather. Kaiden promised. Morven rode south, knowing that he was bringing the king the truth, a truth that would not save him, and that from that day forward, he himself would no longer serve the king. He rode on, compiling lists in his head, lists of what would need to be quietly tampered with, delayed, and lost in the chancery once the king began the war. The old archivist was preparing the most important inventory of his life, an inventory of the sand he would pour into the gears of his own state. Winter at court was a time when Morven led two lives, both worn thin. By day, he was the chancellor preparing for the campaign. At night, he was the man burying that campaign. The king demanded an army by spring. Osmond had received the marshal's staff and was eager to wash away the shame of the flood. Morven nodded, signed, and sabotaged. He routed the order for winter horseshoes for the cavalry through workshops that he knew full well would not be able to keep up. He drew up a contract with the overseas mages that included a clause allowing for termination due to force majeure, and he wrote that clause in his own hand in small script on the last page. Later, at the Wolf's Gate, the senior mage would shout those very words into the sky, and no one would ever know where the mage had gotten them. Morven will learn of this from the reports and will laugh until he cries in his empty office. But the Chancellor has lost his main winter battle, the battle for timing. He had counted on the slushy roads to delay the army until mid-spring and give the North time. Osmond convinced the king to march across the ice. Morven sat in on that council meeting and could not utter a single word of objection because the argument was militarily flawless. He looked at the map where Osmond's finger rested on the frost-bound rivers and thought that now the South would, with its own hands, awaken something the South knew nothing about. On the night the army set out, Morven undertook the most dangerous act of his life. He sent a pigeon north. Not a carrier pigeon bearing a coat of arms, just a common rock pigeon, the kind his late gardener used to keep in the attic. Tied to its leg was a strip of silk bearing 3 words, unsigned. They're marching across the ice. He didn't know if the bird would make it. He didn't know that Alira had already heard the army approaching in those days, and that his silk strip would arrive in Wind City a day later than the wind. That didn't matter. Something else was important. For the first time in 40 years of service, the kingdom's chancellor committed treason, and his conscience was as calm as a winter lake. The court learned of the stand at Wolf's Gate 8 days later, and Morven was present as the news killed the king. The messenger spoke of the converging walls, the living mountain, the voice from the sky, and the fiery pillar that served as a road. Tedric listened, turning pale. Morven looked at his sovereign and saw what no one else saw. He saw a boy whose father had drummed into him that the throne was held by fear. And now came the news that somewhere in the north, power was held by something else, and held more firmly. For Tedric, this was not a military catastrophe. It was a refutation of his very soul. That night, the king spoke of the Black Archive for the first time. Morven had fought for the archive for 2 weeks, and history had not recorded that war. He told the king that the archive had been sealed away by 3 generations of ancestors, not out of greed, but out of terror. He lied, saying the keys had been lost. He forged a report from the Masons Guild stating that opening it would cause the vault to collapse. He did things, any one of which would have earned him the block. It was all in vain. Fear drove the king more fiercely than the chancellor could restrain him. The wall was breached with gunpowder. Morven achieved only one thing, and that single act later saved the world, though the chancellor would never know it. On the night before the breach, he spent 3 hours alone in the archives. He could not remove the spear. The spear lay in a sarcophagus that could only be opened with royal blood. But the archives inventory lay in a simple cabinet, and Morven burned a single sheet from the inventory, the sheet indicating the shelf where the imperial treatise was kept, describing how ancient engineers forged yokes for elemental spirits. He reasoned as follows. The king would find the spear even without the inventory, but at least let the science of subjugation remain unnamed. Tedric's men then spent a month rummaging blindly through the archive and never found the treatise on yokes. A year later, Gundarek the Iron would seek a way to harness the power beneath his mountains and find no teachers. The world never knew that a single burnt page of the inventory stood between it and the second age of yokes. Morven saw the Spear of the Depths once and remembered it for the rest of his life. A black needle in a sarcophagus, and the air around it was dead. The king reached out his hand toward the shaft, and Morven saw a spasm pass across the sovereign's face, not of pain, but of recognition, as if the spear and Tedric had always known each other. From that day on, the chancellor began writing openly to the north, risking his life daily. He wrote about the disputed title, about the bearer, about the resonance that the captive archivist had let slip before dying of a broken heart. The archivist died in exactly the same way as the ancient king's astrologer, and Morven attached that to the letter as well. He sent his final letter already knowing he was under siege. His young secretary, Willem, had been lingering in the evenings for 3 weeks without good reason and had been seen twice near the home of Osmond's relatives. Morven could have disposed of the boy in 10 different ways. He chose not to. Instead, he used his last free days for what mattered most. He evacuated 11 families of northern merchants who were about to be taken hostage from the capital and hid them in monasteries. He transferred the chancellery's secret treasury to front trading houses so that the regency would not be left without funds later on. And he wrote a will in which he bequeathed his library to the school in Vet. They took him at dawn, matter-of-factly and politely. Willem stood behind the guards and avoided eye contact. As Morven passed by, he told the boy that he held no grudge and that informing on others was also archival work, only the inventory was kept on living people. In his cell, the chancellor's first request was for paper, and, out of old habit, they did not refuse him. He sat down and began writing the work he had long envisioned, a treatise on how a state should coexist with a miracle. He was writing it for regents who had not yet come to power, for a king who had not yet been chosen, for a time that, according to his calculations, was bound to come if the hunter below succeeded. And on the night when a tremor swept through the 4 provinces and the prison walls shook, Morven set down his pen, lay on his bunk, face up, and began to wait. He was the only person in the South who knew what that tremor meant. A spear was knocking on a door from 23 years ago. The old archivist lay in the darkness, counting the tremors and speaking aloud to the ceiling, addressing a man in a wyvern skin jacket 1,000 miles away. He told him, "Open it. Open it however you can. Ask her what she's screaming about." Morven learned of the end of the world from the prison porridge. In the morning, after a night of tremors, the porridge was burnt because the cook's hands were shaking. At lunch, the porridge was a festive meal with meat because the guards decided that, before the end, it didn't matter anyway. And on the 3rd day, they brought the usual porridge, and Morven realized that the world had held firm. Prison news trickled up from the guards and was bizarre. They said the king had sunk into the ground. They said that in the north, a goddess had emerged from beneath the city. They said that for an hour, all the rivers of the kingdom had flowed backward. Morven listened, sorted through the rumors, and pieced together a picture more accurately than the entire court upstairs. When it became known that Tedric was returning alone on foot, without a spear and without a guard, the chancellor asked the prison warden for a razor and a clean shirt. The warden asked why. Morven replied that they would soon come for him, and he wanted to make a decent exit. The warden thought the old man had lost his mind. 2 days later, they came for the chancellor. Tedric summoned him to his chambers within the very first hour of his return, and this was recorded in the chronicles. The conversation itself was not recorded in the chronicles, but Morven later considered it the most terrifying and most important conversation of his life. The king sat in a small study by an unheated oven that had aged 20 years. He did not apologize for the dungeon. He immediately began to speak as one recounts a dream that must be shaken off before sunset. He spoke of a void as vast as the sky, about a figure that was everything at once, about how his spear pierced a man, and the man stood his ground and continued to call out someone's name, and about how afterward a creature older than the world crouched down before him. Tedric fell silent for a long time. Then he told the chancellor the reason he had summoned him. He said he had expected the creature to execute him and would have accepted his execution with relief, but the creature took pity on him and asked why he was so afraid. The king raised his eyes to Morven, and in those eyes was sheer humanity. He asked the old man, who had served even his father, whether it was true that the throne was held up only by fear. All his life he had been told that it was true. Morven was silent for a long time. Then, for the only time in his life, he answered without diplomacy. He said that for 40 years he had observed thrones up close. Fear holds the throne just as a rope holds a hanged man, securely and only in one direction. Tedric nodded the way a sick man nods when he finally hears an honest diagnosis. A week later, he abdicated. Morven had drafted the abdication himself, down to the last comma, and included 3 points in the charter that the court, in its confusion, swallowed whole without chewing them over. First, until a king is elected, power passes not to the hereditary nobility, but to a regency council of 7 members chosen by office, not by blood. Second, the council cannot declare war without unanimity. Third, the council's first order of business is to negotiate with the North. Osmond's faction came to its senses a month later and realized that the old man in prison had outmaneuvered them all with a single document, but it was too late. Morven's man led the embassy to the north, and the chancellor read Caden's reply aloud to the council aloud himself. As he read about the Treaty of Equals, the shared waters, and the common court, he reached the request to hand over the imperial archives to the north and couldn't help himself. He burst out laughing in the middle of the session. The council looked at him in alarm. Morven, having laughed it off, explained that he was laughing out of relief. For 40 years he had watched people who had seized power demand the lands of crowns and the heads of others. This one was demanding some old papers. With a neighbor like that, one could live for centuries. To himself, he thought otherwise. He thought the hunter was asking for the archives because somewhere in the world other doors lay dormant, and that the papers in those files were a weapon far better than lances. He turned out to be right sooner than he'd thought. After signing the treaty, Morven traveled north for the first time in years, not as an ambassador, but a guest. He was carrying 3 wagon loads of archives and his own chest, which held the instructions he'd written in prison. In Vetrogard, he was welcomed as one of their own. Bren shook his hand so hard that old bones creaked. Selma treated him to herbal teas to ease his travel weariness. And then he was led to the Temple of the 4 Winds for a memorial service for the nameless exiles who had perished in the old storms, and the priest, among the names, commemorated the servant of God, Tormod. The volunteer kept the promise he'd made a year ago at the gate. The old chancellor stood in the White Temple, listening to the name of his wife's grandfather and weeping openly for the first time since Ingrid's funeral. On that visit, he saw her, too, the one from the beginning. He had prepared for this encounter as if it were the exam of a lifetime, and all his preparations crumbled in the very first second. The woman, whose face reminded him of his late mother, approached him first and thanked him. Morven asked her why. She replied that she had seen him in a dream. The man who had kept the scorched pages for 23 years and never given them to anyone. The man who had burned the page about the fair. She said that the world does not stand on heroes. The world stands on archivists who know that not all knowledge needs to be brought to kings. Morven, an old cynic who had outlived 4 sovereigns, stood before her like a young scribe and could not utter a word. That evening, he gave Caden his prison-written treatise. Caden read it overnight, and in the morning offered the old man what he had been resisting for a week, and to which he ultimately agreed. To become the first chancellor of the Alliance Treaty, a bridge between the South and the North. Morven grumbled that he was too old, that he wanted to stick to his books, and that the position was a fabrication. As he agreed, he realized he was happy. And in the fall of that year, something happened that Morven later called his final intelligence mission. While sorting through the imperial archives he had brought back, along with the documents from Wind City, he was the first to stumble upon the registry of the Empire's Western expeditions. And he was the first to read the lines about the 4 yokes forged for the spirits of the Western Mountains and handed over to the mining clans of Westmark. He sat poring over the sheet and felt the circle of his life closing. He had once destroyed the art of yoke forging. Now he held in his hands an inventory of those already forged. He took the sheet to Caden himself, trusting it to no one else. And watching the hunter's face darken as he read the lines about the harnessed children of the sleeper, he said quietly that it seemed it was too early for him again. The doors to this world showed no sign of closing. During the years of the Morven Alliance, he lived as he had never lived before, in work that did not soil his hands. He built the position of Treaty Chancellor from nothing, following his own prison-honed principles. The General Court for Disputed Cases held sessions alternately in the 2 capitals, and Morven ensured that the judges were approved by both sides. He established a common channel through such a web of mutual obligations that even future corrupt rulers would be unable to shut it down without bankrupting their own treasuries. He built mundane things, regulations, registers, procedures. He told his young assistants that hunters perform miracles, but miracles live in offices. Without an inventory, even a miracle will be plundered. Morven entered the history of the Steel Winter as a footnote, though he should have been a chapter. When the North declared a trade boycott against the penal baronies, Westmark filed a complaint with the Alliance Court, demanding that the boycott be recognized as a violation of trade freedoms. It was a dangerous case. Had the North lost it, all of Caden's hunting operations in the West would have collapsed right from the start. Morven pored over the complaint for 3 nights and found the answer. In the Imperial Trade Code, upon which Westmark had based his claim, there was Article 12, stating that goods produced by forced labor are not considered goods, but rather evidence. This article had not been applied for 400 years. The court applied it. Westmark's complaint was dismissed, and with it, the legal cover for the penal pits was gone. Caden later sent the old man a barrel of northern honey with a 1-line note. The note stated that the best weapon was still kept in the archives. Morven placed the note under the glass on his desk. When Gundirect declared war on the North, the South was shaken. Osman's party rose again in a new form and proclaimed that this was the chance to strike the North in the back and restore its former glory. Morven endured the worst week of his new life at that time. He was old. Half the members of the Regency Council had been replaced. The young ones did not remember the Wolf's Gate. The Union Chancellor went from the homes of the councillors on foot, like a supplicant, and in every house laid the same thing on the table, a copy of an old report on the stand, which detailed how many Southern recruits the North had let go alive. 7,000 who had gone north, and 3,000 who had returned home. 10,000 families, he said, in every house. 10,000 families in the South are alive because the North does not kill. Think about how we'll be remembered in the annals if we stab in the back the one who spared our children. The council voted for neutrality by a margin of 1 vote. Morven considered that single vote the greatest victory of his old age. He learned of the events in Westmark's capital through the fire. By that time, a connection had been established between Pariah and the fireplace in his study, one of which even the council was unaware. On the night the yoke broke, Morven's fireplace flared up on its own, and in the flames the old man saw the reflections of a foreign city and heard distant singing. He sat by the fire until dawn. In the morning, he opened the session by declaring that there would be no war for anyone at all, and asked his secretary to prepare the documents for Westmark's admission into the alliance treaty. By that time, Willem was serving as his secretary, that very same informer. Morven found him a year after his release, an alcoholic who had been cast out by Osmundo's relatives as surplus to requirements. The old man took him in, amid the astonished murmurs of all his acquaintances. When asked why, he replied that a good archive needs someone who knows the true cost of betrayal from the inside. Willem served him for 20 years afterward, the kind of service one does not do for money. Morven traveled to the wedding in the Five Lands, bearing gifts from the Regency Council and his own gift, which no one knew about. On the day of the wedding, when the primordial joined the Five Hands, he stood in the front row of guests, clutching a small bundle to his chest. After the ceremony, he approached Caden and his 4 wives and unwrapped the cloth. There lay a charred notebook, his own copy of the imperial report, handwritten by a young scribe 40 years ago. The one that started it all. He said the document had served its purpose and asked that it be accepted not into the archives, but into the family. Let it rest in the house where the meeting took place, and the choice was made. Alira wept so fiercely that the wind blew the guests' hats away. He feasted at the wedding for all 3 days, and on the second day he was seen dancing with Selma, an event that later made the rounds in the chronicles of both states. Morven spent his final years living between 2 homes. In winter, he was in the south, attending to contractual matters. In the summer, he went north to the Five Lands Library, to which he had bequeathed books even while in prison, and where he now came simply to read. He witnessed the birth of Pariah's daughter and gave her her first book, with iron pages commissioned from Holt. He examined the first overseers heading east and grilled them on archival knowledge while Caden laughed. He lived to see the day when news came from the east that the elders of the shipbuilders had begun to cleanse their ocean, and the bad dreams of the primordial of the seas grew lighter. On his final trip north, Morven was very old and already knew this. He climbed the wall of Wind City alone that evening. Below lay the Five Lands, ablaze with lights. The wind danced above the temple. The old man stood and did what he had done all his life. He counted. He counted the years from the charred chest in the archive to this evening. It came to 47. He counted how many times over those years the world had hung by a thread. It came to 6. He counted how many of those 6 times the thread had been held not by swords, but by a document read in time, a page burned in time, a question asked in time. It came to 6 out of 6. The old archivist smiled in the darkness and acknowledged that his life had been a success. From below the temple drifted the evening hymn and the 5-syllable word with which it began. Morven listened to the name that had once been erased from all the chronicles and that now the whole land was singing. He thought of his wife, about how her grandfather lay in consecrated ground, about how the doors he had guarded all his life had been opened by another man, But gatekeepers were still needed. Without gatekeepers, one doesn't live to see the doors. He died the following spring in the south, in his study, surrounded by papers, just as he had wished. Willem found him in the morning. The quill lay on an unfinished set of regulations concerning the training of young archivists. The chancellor was buried twice. In accordance with his will, his body was taken north and laid to rest on a sunny hillside next to the nameless exiles, among whom lay his wife's grandfather. The entire 5 lands attended the funeral, and so did the Arvanus, the 4 elements and their representative. And the primordial one did something she had never done for any mortal. She sang over the archivist's grave that very lullaby of peace with which she had once lulled her brother to sleep. She told those who remained that this man had held the door from the other side for 40 years and deserved the quietest of sleeps. In accordance with his will, no titles were carved on the stone. Instead, they carved a single line that Morven himself had composed while still in prison. Here lies the man who did not hand over a certain document to the kings in time. Passers-by, remember him, and consider what you yourself hold dear.